Chapter 34. My lady tells the truth. Is there any room in which I can talk to you alone? Robert Audley asked, as he looked dubiously round the hall. My lady only bowed her head in answer. She pushed open the door of the library, which had been left ajar. Sir Michael had gone to his dressing-room to prepare for dinner after a day of lazy enjoyment, perfectly legitimate for an invalid. The apartment was quite empty, only lighted by the blaze of the fire, as it had been upon the previous evening. Lady Audley entered the room, followed by Robert, who closed the door behind him. The wretched, shivering woman went to the fireplace and knelt down before the blaze, as if any natural warmth could have power to check that unnatural chill. The young man followed her, and stood beside her upon the hearth, with his arm resting upon the chimney-piece. Lady Audley, he said, in a voice whose icy sternness held out no hope of any tenderness or compassion, I spoke to you last night very plainly, but you refused to listen to me. Tonight I must speak to you still more plainly, and you must no longer refuse to listen to me. My lady, crouching before the fire with her face hidden in her hands, uttered a low, sobbing sound which was almost a moan, but made no other answer. There was a fire last night at Mount Stanning, Lady Audley, the pitiless voice proceeded, the Castle Inn, the house in which I slept, was burned to the ground. Do you know how I escaped perishing in that destruction? No. I escaped by a most providential circumstance which seems a very simple one. I did not sleep in the room which had been prepared for me. The place seemed wretchedly damp and chilly, the chimney smoked abominably when an attempt was made at lighting a fire. And I persuaded the servant to make me up a bed on the sofa in the small ground-floor sitting-room which I had occupied during the evening. He paused for a moment, watching the crouching figure. The only change in my lady's attitude was that her head had fallen a little lower. Shall I tell you by whose agency the destruction of the Castle Inn was brought about, my lady? There was no answer. Shall I tell you? Still the same obstinate silence. My Lady Audley, cried Robert, suddenly, you are the incendiary. It was you whose murderous hand kindled those flames. It was you who thought by that thrice horrible deed to rid yourself of me, your enemy and denouncer. What was it to you that other lives might be sacrificed? If by a second massacre of St. Bartholomew you could have ridded yourself of me, you would have sacrificed an army of victims. The day is past for tenderness and mercy. For you I can no longer know pity or compunction. So far as by sparing your shame I can spare others who must suffer by your shame, I will be merciful, but no further. If there were any secret tribunal before which you might be made to answer for your crimes, I would have little scruple in being your accuser. But I would spare that generous and high-born gentleman upon whose noble name your infamy would be reflected. His voice softened as he made this allusion, and for a moment he broke down, but he recovered himself by an effort and continued. No life was lost in the fire of last night. I slept lightly, my lady, for my mind was troubled, as it has been for a long time, by the misery which I knew was lowering upon this house. It was I who discovered the breaking out of the fire in time to give the alarm and to save the servant girl and the poor drunken wretch, who was very much burnt in spite of my efforts. And who now lies in a precarious state at his mother's cottage. It was from him and from his wife that I learned who had visited the Castle Inn in the dead of the night. The woman was almost distracted when she saw me, and from her I discovered the particulars of last night. Heaven knows what other secrets of yours she may hold, my lady, or how easily they might be extorted from her if I wanted her aid, which I do not. My path lies very straight before me. I have sworn to bring the murderer of George Talboys to justice, and I will keep my oath. I say that it was by your agency my friend met with his death. If I have wondered sometimes, as it was only natural I should, whether I was not the victim of some horrible hallucination. Whether such an alternative was not more probable than that a young and lovely woman should be capable of so foul and treacherous a murder, all wonder is past. After last night's deed of horror, there is no crime you could commit, however vast and unnatural, which could make me wonder. Henceforth you must seem to me no longer a woman, a guilty woman with a heart which in its worst wickedness has yet some latent power to suffer and feel. I look upon you henceforth as the demoniac incarnation of some evil principle. But you shall no longer pollute this place by your presence. Unless you will confess what you are and who you are in the presence of the man you have deceived so long, and accept from him and from me such mercy as we may be inclined to extend to you. I will gather together the witnesses who shall swear to your identity, and at peril of any shame to myself and those I love, I will bring upon you the just and awful punishment of your crime. The woman rose suddenly and stood before him erect and resolute, with her hair dashed away from her face and her eyes glittering. "Bring Sir Michael," she cried. "Bring him here, and I will confess anything, everything. What do I care? God knows I have struggled hard enough against you, and fought the battle patiently enough. But you have conquered, Mr. Robert Audley. It is a great triumph, is it not, a wonderful victory? You have used your cool, calculating, frigid, luminous intellect to a noble purpose. You have conquered a mad woman." "A mad woman," cried Mr. Audley. "Yes, a mad woman. When you say that I killed George Talboys, you say the truth. When you say that I murdered him treacherously and foully, you lie. I killed him because I am mad. Because my intellect is a little way upon the wrong side of that narrow boundary line between sanity and insanity. Because, when George Talboys goaded me, as you have goaded me, and reproached me, and threatened me, my mind, never properly balanced, utterly lost its balance, and I was mad. Bring Sir Michael. And bring him quickly. If he is to be told one thing, let him be told everything, let him hear the secret of my life." Robert Audley left the room to look for his uncle. He went in search of that honored kinsman with God knows how heavy a weight of anguish at his heart, for he knew he was about to shatter the daydream of his uncle's life. And he knew that our dreams are none the less terrible to lose, because they have never been the realities for which we have mistaken them. But even in the midst of his sorrow for Sir Michael, he could not help wondering at my lady's last words, "the secret of my life." He remembered those lines in the letter written by Helen Talboys upon the eve of her flight from Wildernsea, which had so puzzled him. He remembered those appealing sentences, "You should forgive me, for you know why I have been so. You know the secret of my life." He met Sir Michael in the hall. He made no attempt to prepare the way for the terrible revelation which the baronet was to hear. He only drew him into the fire-lit library, and there for the first time addressed him quietly thus, "Lady Audley has a confession to make to you. Sir, a confession which I know will be a most cruel surprise, a most bitter grief. But it is necessary for your present honor, and for your future peace, that you should hear it. She has deceived you, I regret to say, most basely. But it is only right that you should hear from her own lips any excuses which she may have to offer for her wickedness. May God soften this blow for you." Sobbed the young man, suddenly breaking down, "I cannot." Sir Michael lifted his hand as if he would command his nephew to be silent, but that imperious hand dropped feeble and impotent at his side. He stood in the center of the firelit room rigid and immovable. "Lucy!" he cried, in a voice whose anguish struck like a blow upon the jarred nerves of those who heard it, as the cry of a wounded animal pains the listener, "Lucy, tell me that this man is a madman. Tell me so, my love, or I shall kill him." There was a sudden fury in his voice as he turned upon Robert, as if he could indeed have felled his wife's accuser to the earth with the strength of his uplifted arm. But my lady fell upon her knees at his feet, interposing herself between the baronet and his nephew, who stood leaning on the back of an easy chair, with his face hidden by his hand. "He has told you the truth," said my lady, "and he is not mad. I have sent him for you that I may confess everything to you. I should be sorry for you if I could, for you have been very, very good to me, much better to me than I ever deserved, but I can't, I can feel nothing but my own misery. I told you long ago that I was selfish, I am selfish still, more selfish than ever in my misery. Happy, prosperous people may feel for others. I laugh at other people's sufferings. They seemed so small compared to my own. When first my lady had fallen on her knees, Sir Michael had attempted to raise her, and had remonstrated with her. But as she spoke he dropped into a chair close to the spot upon which she knelt, and with his hands clasped together, and with his head bent to catch every syllable of those horrible words. He listened as if his whole being had been resolved into that one sense of hearing. "I must tell you the story of my life. In order to tell you why I have become the miserable wretch who has no better hope than to be allowed to run away and hide in some desolate corner of the earth. I must tell you the story of my life," repeated my lady, "but you need not fear that I shall dwell long upon it. It has not been so pleasant to me that I should wish to remember it. When I was a very little child I remember asking a question which it was natural enough that I should ask, God help me. I asked where my mother was. I had a faint remembrance of a face, like what my own is now, looking at me when I was very little better than a baby, but I had missed the face suddenly, and had never seen it since. They told me that mother was away. I was not happy, for the woman who had charge of me was a disagreeable woman and the place in which we lived was a lonely place, a village upon the Hampshire coast, about 7 miles from Portsmouth. My father, who was in the Navy, only came now and then to see me. And I was left almost entirely to the charge of this woman, who was irregularly paid, and who vented her rage upon me when my father was behindhand in remitting her money. So you see that at a very early age I found out what it was to be poor. Perhaps it was more from being discontented with my dreary life than from any wonderful impulse of affection, that I asked very often the same question about my mother. I always received the same answer, she was away. When I asked where, I was told that that was a secret. When I grew old enough to understand the meaning of the word death, I asked if my mother was dead, and I was told, no, she was not dead, she was ill, and she was away. I asked how long she had been ill, and I was told that she had been so some years, ever since I was a baby. At last the secret came out. I worried my foster mother with the old question one day when the remittances had fallen very much in arrear, and her temper had been unusually tried. She flew into a passion, and told me that my mother was a mad woman, and that she was in a madhouse 40 miles away. She had scarcely said this when she repented, and told me that it was not the truth, and that I was not to believe it, or to say that she had told me such a thing. I discovered afterward that my father had made her promise most solemnly never to tell me the secret of my mother's fate. I brooded horribly upon the thought of my mother's madness. It haunted me by day and night. I was always picturing to myself this mad woman pacing up and down some prison cell, in a hideous garment that bound her tortured limbs. I had exaggerated ideas of the horror of her situation. I had no knowledge of the different degrees of madness, and the image that haunted me was that of a distraught and violent creature, who would fall upon me and kill me if I came within her reach. This idea grew upon me until I used to awake in the dead of night, screaming aloud in an agony of terror, from a dream in which I had felt my mother's icy grasp upon my throat, and heard her ravings in my ear. When I was 10 years old my father came to pay up the arrears due to my protectress, and to take me to school. He had left me in Hampshire longer than he had intended, from his inability to pay this money. So there again I felt the bitterness of poverty, and ran the risk of growing up an ignorant creature among coarse rustic children, because my father was poor. My lady paused for a moment, but only to take breath, for she had spoken rapidly, as if eager to tell this hated story, and to have done with it. She was still on her knees, but Sir Michael made no effort to raise her. He sat silent and immovable. What was this story that he was listening to? Whose was it, and to what was it to lead? It could not be his wife's. He had heard her simple account of her youth, and had believed it as he had believed in the gospel. She had told him a very brief story of an early orphanage and a long, quiet, colorless youth spent in the conventional seclusion of an English boarding school. My father came at last, and I told him what I had discovered. He was very much affected when I spoke of my mother. He was not what the world generally calls a good man, but I learned afterward that he had loved his wife very dearly, and that he would have willingly sacrificed his life to her. and constituted himself her guardian, had he not been compelled to earn the daily bread of the mad woman and her child by the exercise of his profession. So here again I beheld what a bitter thing it is to be poor. My mother, who might have been tended by a devoted husband, was given over to the care of hired nurses. Before my father sent me to school at Torquay, he took me to see my mother. This visit served at least to dispel the idea which had so often terrified me. I saw no raving, straight-waistcoated maniac, guarded by zealous jailers, but a golden-haired, blue-eyed, girlish creature, who seemed as frivolous as a butterfly, and who skipped toward us with her yellow curls decorated with natural flowers, and saluted us with radiant smiles, and gay, ceaseless chatter. But she didn't know us. She would have spoken in the same manner to any stranger who had entered the gates of the garden about her prison house. Her madness was an hereditary disease transmitted to her from her mother, who had died mad. She, my mother, had been, or had appeared sane up to the hour of my birth, but from that hour her intellect had decayed, and she had become what I saw her. I went away with the knowledge of this, and with the knowledge that the only inheritance I had to expect from my mother was insanity. I went away with this knowledge in my mind, and with something more, a secret to keep. I was a child of 10 years only, but I felt all the weight of that burden. I was to keep the secret of my mother's madness, for it was a secret that might affect me injuriously in afterlife. I was to remember this. I did remember this. And it was, perhaps, this that made me selfish and heartless, for I suppose I am heartless. As I grew older I was told that I was pretty, beautiful, lovely, bewitching. I heard all these things at first indifferently, but by and by I listened to them greedily, and began to think that in spite of the secret of my life I might be more successful in the world's great lottery than my companions. I had learnt that which in some indefinite manner or other every schoolgirl learns sooner or later. I learned that my ultimate fate in life depended upon my marriage. And I concluded that if I was indeed prettier than my schoolfellows, I ought to marry better than any one of them. I left school before I was 17 years of age, with this thought in my mind, and I went to live at the other extremity of England with my father, who had retired upon his half-pay, and had established himself at Wildernsea, with the idea that the place was cheap and select. The place was indeed select. I had not been there a month before I discovered that even the prettiest girl might wait a long time for a rich husband. I wished to hurry over this part of my life. I dare say I was very despicable. You and your nephew, Sir Michael, have been rich all your lives, and can very well afford to despise me. But I knew how far poverty can affect a life, and I looked forward with a sickening dread to a life so affected. At last the rich suitor, the wandering prince, came. She paused for a moment, and shuddered convulsively. It was impossible to see any of the changes in her countenance, for her face was obstinately bent toward the floor. Throughout her long confession she never lifted it, throughout her long confession her voice was never broken by a tear. What she had to tell she told in a cold, hard tone, very much the tone in which some criminal, dogged and sullen to the last, might have confessed to a jail chaplain. The wandering prince came, she repeated. He was called George Talboys. For the first time since his wife's confession had begun, Sir Michael Audley started. He began to understand it all now. A crowd of unheeded words and forgotten circumstances that had seemed too insignificant for remark or recollection flashed back upon him as vividly as if they had been the leading incidents of his past life. Mr. George Talboys was a cornet in a dragoon regiment. He was the only son of a rich country gentleman. He fell in love with me, and married me 3 months after my 17th birthday. I think I loved him as much as it was in my power to love anybody. Not more than I have loved you, Sir Michael, not so much, for when you married me you elevated me to a position that he could never have given me. The dream was broken. Sir Michael Audley remembered that summer's evening, nearly 2 years ago, when he had first declared his love for Mr. Dawson's governess. He remembered the sick, half-shuddering sensation of regret and disappointment that had come over him then, and he felt as if it had in some manner dimly foreshadowed the agony of tonight. But I do not believe that even in his misery he felt that entire and unmitigated surprise. That utter revulsion of feeling that is felt when a good woman wanders away from herself and becomes the lost creature whom her husband is bound in honor to abjure. I do not believe that Sir Michael Audley had ever really believed in his wife. He had loved her and admired her, he had been bewitched by her beauty and bewildered by her charms. But that sense of something wanting, that vague feeling of loss and disappointment which had come upon him on the summer's night of his betrothal had been with him more or less distinctly ever since. I cannot believe that an honest man, however pure and single may be his mind, however simply trustful his nature, is ever really deceived by falsehood. There is beneath the voluntary confidence an involuntary distrust, not to be conquered by any effort of the will. We were married, my lady continued, and I loved him very well, quite well enough to be happy with him as long as his money lasted, and while we were on the continent, traveling in the best style and always staying at the best hotels. But when we came back to Wildernsea and lived with Papa, and all the money was gone, and George grew gloomy and wretched, and was always thinking of his troubles, and appeared to neglect me, I was very unhappy, and it seemed as if this fine marriage had only given me a 12 months' gaiety and extravagance after all. I begged George to appeal to his father, but he refused. I persuaded him to try and get employment, and he failed. My baby was born, and the crisis which had been fatal to my mother arose for me. I escaped, but I was more irritable perhaps after my recovery, less inclined to fight the hard battle of the world, more disposed to complain of poverty and neglect. I did complain one day, loudly and bitterly. I upbraided George Talboys for his cruelty in having allied a helpless girl to poverty and misery, and he flew into a passion with me and ran out of the house. When I awoke the next morning, I found a letter lying on the table by my bed, telling me that he was going to the Antipodes to seek his fortune, and that he would never see me again until he was a rich man. I looked upon this as a desertion, and I resented it bitterly, resented it by hating the man who had left me with no protector but a weak, tipsy father, and with a child to support. I had to work hard for my living, and in every hour of labor, and what labor is more wearisome than the dull slavery of a governess, I recognized a separate wrong done me by George Talboys. His father was rich, his sister was living in luxury and respectability, and I, his wife, and the mother of his son, was a slave allied to beggary and obscurity. People pitied me, and I hated them for their pity. I did not love the child, for he had been left a burden upon my hands. The hereditary taint that was in my blood had never until this time showed itself by any one sign or token, but at this time I became subject to fits of violence and despair. At this time I think my mind first lost its balance, and for the first time I crossed that invisible line which separates reason from madness. I have seen my father's eyes fixed upon me in horror and alarm. I have known him soothe me as only mad people and children are soothed, and I have chafed against his petty devices, I have resented even his indulgence. At last these fits of desperation resolved themselves into a desperate purpose. I determined to run away from this wretched home which my slavery supported. I determined to desert this father who had more fear of me than love for me. I determined to go to London and lose myself in that great chaos of humanity. I had seen an advertisement in the Times while I was at Wildernsea, and I presented myself to Mrs. Vincent, the advertiser, under a feigned name. She accepted me, waiving all questions as to my antecedents. You know the rest. I came here, and you made me an offer, the acceptance of which would lift me at once into the sphere to which my ambition had pointed ever since I was a schoolgirl. And heard for the first time that I was pretty. 3 years had passed, and I had received no token of my husband's existence. For, I argued, that if he had returned to England, he would have succeeded in finding me under any name and in any place. I knew the energy of his character well enough to know this. I said, I have a right to think that he is dead, or that he wishes me to believe him dead, and his shadow shall not stand between me and prosperity. I said this, and I became your wife, Sir Michael, with every resolution to be as good a wife as it was in my nature to be. The common temptations that assail and shipwreck some women had no terror for me. I would have been your true and pure wife to the end of time, though I had been surrounded by a legion of tempters. The mad folly that the world calls love had never had any part in my madness, and here at least extremes met, and the vice of heartlessness became the virtue of constancy. I was very happy in the first triumph and grandeur of my new position, very grateful to the hand that had lifted me to it. In the sunshine of my own happiness I felt, for the first time in my life, for the miseries of others. I had been poor myself, and I was now rich, and could afford to pity and relieve the poverty of my neighbors. I took pleasure in acts of kindness and benevolence. I found out my father's address and sent him large sums of money, anonymously, for I did not wish him to discover what had become of me. I availed myself to the full of the privilege your generosity afforded me. I dispensed happiness on every side. I saw myself loved as well as admired, and I think I might have been a good woman for the rest of my life, if fate would have allowed me to be so. I believe that at this time my mind regained its just balance. I had watched myself very closely since leaving Wildernsea. I had held a check upon myself. I had often wondered while sitting in the surgeon's quiet family circle whether any suspicion of that invisible, hereditary taint had ever occurred to Mr. Dawson. Fate would not suffer me to be good. My destiny compelled me to be a wretch. Within a month of my marriage, I read in one of the Essex papers of the return of a certain Mr. Talboys, a fortunate gold seeker, from Australia. The ship had sailed at the time I read the paragraph. What was to be done? I said just now that I knew the energy of George's character. I knew that the man who had gone to the Antipodes and won a fortune for his wife would leave no stone unturned in his efforts to find her. It was hopeless to think of hiding myself from him. Unless he could be induced to believe that I was dead, he would never cease in his search for me. My brain was dazed as I thought of my peril. Again the balance trembled, again the invisible boundary was passed, again I was mad. I went down to Southampton and found my father, who was living there with my child. You remember how Mrs. Vincent's name was used as an excuse for this hurried journey, and how it was contrived I should go with no other escort than Phoebe Marks, whom I left at the hotel while I went to my father's house. I confided to my father the whole secret of my peril. He was not very much shocked at what I had done, for poverty had perhaps blunted his sense of honor and principle. He was not very much shocked, but he was frightened, and he promised to do all in his power to assist me in my horrible emergency. He had received a letter addressed to me at Wildernsea, by George, and forwarded from there to my father. This letter had been written within a few days of the sailing of the Argus, and it announced the probable date of the ship's arrival at Liverpool. This letter gave us, therefore, data upon which to act. We decided at once upon the first step. This was that on the date of the probable arrival of the Argus, or a few days later, an advertisement of my death should be inserted in the Times. But almost immediately after deciding upon this, we saw that there were fearful difficulties in the carrying out of such a simple plan. The date of the death, and the place in which I died, must be announced, as well as the death itself. George would immediately hurry to that place, however distant it might be, however comparatively inaccessible, and the shallow falsehood would be discovered. I knew enough of his sanguine temperament, his courage and determination, his readiness to hope against hope, to know that unless he saw the grave in which I was buried, and the register of my death, he would never believe that I was lost to him. My father was utterly dumbfounded and helpless. He could only shed childish tears of despair and terror. He was of no use to me in this crisis. I was hopeless of any issue out of my difficulties. I began to think that I must trust to the chapter of accidents, and hope that among other obscure corners of the earth, Audley Court might be undreamt of by my husband. I sat with my father, drinking tea with him in his miserable hovel, and playing with the child, who was pleased with my dress and jewels, but quite unconscious that I was anything but a stranger to him. I had the boy in my arms, when a woman who attended him came to fetch him that she might make him more fit to be seen by the lady, as she said. I was anxious to know how the boy was treated, and I detained this woman in conversation with me while my father dozed over the tea-table. She was a pale-faced, sandy-haired woman of about 45, and she seemed very glad to get the chance of talking to me as long as I pleased to allow her. She soon left off talking of the boy, however, to tell me of her own troubles. She was in very great trouble, she told me. Her eldest daughter had been obliged to leave her situation from ill health. In fact, the doctor said the girl was in a decline, and it was a hard thing for a poor widow who had seen better days to have a sick daughter to support, as well as a family of young children. I let the woman run on for a long time in this manner, telling me the girl's ailments, and the girl's age, and the girl's doctor's stuff, and piety, and sufferings, and a great deal more. But I neither listened to her nor heeded her. I heard her, but only in a far-away manner, as I heard the traffic in the street, or the ripple of the stream at the bottom of it. What were this woman's troubles to me? I had miseries of my own, and worse miseries than her coarse nature could ever have to endure. These sort of people always had sick husbands or sick children, and expected to be helped in their illness by the rich. It was nothing out of the common. I was thinking this, and I was just going to dismiss the woman with a sovereign for her sick daughter, when an idea flashed upon me with such painful suddenness that it sent the blood surging up to my brain, and set my heart beating, as it only beats when I am mad. I asked the woman her name. She was a Mrs. Plowson, and she kept a small general shop, she said, and only ran in now and then to look after Georgie, and to see that the little maid-of-all-work took care of him. Her daughter's name was Matilda. I asked her several questions about this girl Matilda, and I ascertained that she was 24, that she had always been consumptive, and that she was now, as the doctor said, going off in a rapid decline. He had declared that she could not last much more than a fortnight. It was in 3 weeks that the ship that carried George Talboys was expected to anchor in the Mersey. I need not dwell upon this business. I visited the sick girl. She was fair and slender. Her description, carelessly given, might tally nearly enough with my own, though she bore no shadow of resemblance to me, except in these 2 particulars. I was received by the girl as a rich lady who wished to do her a service. I bought the mother, who was poor and greedy, and who for a gift of money, more money than she had ever before received, consented to submit to anything I wished. Upon the 2nd day after my introduction to this Mrs. Plowson, my father went over to Ventnor, and hired lodgings for his invalid daughter and her little boy. Early the next morning he carried over the dying girl and Georgie, who had been bribed to call her mamma. She entered the house as Mrs. Talboys. She was attended by a Ventnor medical man as Mrs. Talboys. She died, and her death and burial were registered in that name. The advertisement was inserted in the Times, and upon the 2nd day after its insertion George Talboys visited Ventnor, and ordered the tombstone which at this hour records the death of his wife, Helen Talboys. Sir Michael Audley rose slowly, and with a stiff, constrained action, as if every physical sense had been benumbed by that one sense of misery. "I cannot hear any more," he said, in a hoarse whisper. "If there is anything more to be told I cannot hear it. Robert, it is you who have brought about this discovery, as I understand. I want to know nothing more. Will you take upon yourself the duty of providing for the safety and comfort of this lady whom I have thought my wife? I need not ask you to remember in all you do, that I have loved her very dearly and truly. I cannot say farewell to her. I will not say it until I can think of her without bitterness, until I can pity her, as I now pray that God may pity her this night." Sir Michael walked slowly from the room. He did not trust himself to look at that crouching figure. He did not wish to see the creature whom he had cherished. He went straight to his dressing-room, rung for his valet, and ordered him to pack a portmanteau, and make all necessary arrangements for accompanying his master by the last up train. Chapter 35. The Hush That Succeeds the Tempest. Robert Audley followed his uncle into the vestibule after Sir Michael had spoken those few quiet words which sounded the death knell of his hope and love. Heaven knows how much the young man had feared the coming of this day. It had come. And though there had been no great outburst of despair, no whirlwind of stormy grief, no loud tempest of anguish and tears, Robert took no comforting thought from the unnatural stillness. He knew enough to know that Sir Michael Audley went away with the barbed arrow, which his nephew's hand had sent home to its aim, rankling in his tortured heart. He knew that this strange and icy calm was the first numbness of a heart stricken by grief so unexpected as for a time to be rendered almost incomprehensible by a blank stupor of astonishment. He knew that when this dull quiet had passed away, when little by little, and one by one, each horrible feature of the sufferer's sorrow became first dimly apparent and then terribly familiar to him, the storm would burst in fatal fury, and tempests of tears and cruel thunderclaps of agony would rend that generous heart. Robert had heard of cases in which men of his uncle's age had borne some great grief, as Sir Michael had borne this, with a strange quiet, and had gone away from those who would have comforted them, and whose anxieties have been relieved by this patient stillness. To fall down upon the ground and die under the blow which at first had only stunned him. He remembered cases in which paralysis and apoplexy had stricken men as strong as his uncle in the first hour of the horrible affliction. And he lingered in the lamplit vestibule, wondering whether it was not his duty to be with Sir Michael, to be near him, in case of any emergency, and to accompany him wherever he went. Yet would it be wise to force himself upon that grey-headed sufferer in this cruel hour, in which he had been awakened from the one delusion of a blameless life to discover that he had been the dupe of a false face, and the fool of a nature which was too coldly mercenary, too cruelly heartless, to be sensible of its own infamy? No, thought Robert Audley, I will not intrude upon the anguish of this wounded heart. There is humiliation mingled with this bitter grief. It is better he should fight the battle alone. I have done what I believe to have been my solemn duty, yet I should scarcely wonder if I had rendered myself forever hateful to him. It is better he should fight the battle alone. I can do nothing to make the strife less terrible. Better that it should be fought alone. While the young man stood with his hand upon the library door, still half doubtful whether he should follow his uncle or re-enter the room in which he had left that more wretched creature whom it had been his business to unmask, Alicia Audley opened the dining-room door, and revealed to him the old-fashioned oak-paneled apartment, the long table covered with showy damask, and bright with a cheerful glitter of glass and silver. "Is Papa coming to dinner?" asked Miss Audley. "I'm so hungry, and poor Tomlins has sent up 3 times to say the fish will be spoiled. It must be reduced to a species of isinglass soup, by this time, I should think," added the young lady, as she came out into the vestibule with the Times newspaper in her hand. She had been sitting by the fire reading the paper, and waiting for her seniors to join her at the dinner table. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Robert Audley," she remarked, indifferently. "You dine with us of course. Pray go and find Papa. It must be nearly 8 o'clock, and we are supposed to dine at 6. Mr. Audley answered his cousin rather sternly. Her frivolous manner jarred upon him, and he forgot in his irrational displeasure that Miss Audley had known nothing of the terrible drama which had been so long enacting under her very nose. "Your papa has just endured a very great grief, Alicia," the young man said, gravely. The girl's arch, laughing face changed in a moment to a tenderly earnest look of sorrow and anxiety. Alicia Audley loved her father very dearly. "A grief?" she exclaimed. "Papa grieved? Oh! Robert, what has happened?" "I can tell you nothing yet, Alicia," Robert answered in a low voice. He took his cousin by the wrist, and drew her into the dining-room as he spoke. He closed the door carefully behind him before he continued. "Alicia, can I trust you?" he asked, earnestly. "Trust me to do what?" "To be a comfort and a friend to your poor father under a very heavy affliction." "Yes," cried Alicia, passionately. "How can you ask me such a question? Do you think there is anything I would not do to lighten any sorrow of my father's? Do you think there is anything I would not suffer if my suffering could lighten his? The rushing tears rose to Miss Audley's bright grey eyes as she spoke. Oh, Robert! Robert! Could you think so badly of me as to think I would not try to be a comfort to my father in his grief? She said, reproachfully. No, no, my dear, answered the young man, quietly, I never doubted your affection, I only doubted your discretion. May I rely upon that? You may, Robert, said Alicia, resolutely. Very well, then, my dear girl, I will trust you. Your father is going to leave the court, for a time at least. The grief which he has just endured, a sudden and unlooked-for sorrow, remember, has no doubt made this place hateful to him. He is going away, but he must not go alone, must he, Alicia? Alone? No. No. But I suppose my lady. Lady Audley will not go with him, said Robert, gravely, he is about to separate himself from her. For a time? No, forever. Separate himself from her forever, exclaimed Alicia. Then this grief is connected with Lady Audley. Lady Audley is the cause of your father's sorrow. Alicia's face, which had been pale before, flushed crimson. Sorrow, of which my lady was the cause, a sorrow which was to separate Sir Michael forever from his wife. There had been no quarrel between them, there had never been anything but harmony and sunshine between Lady Audley and her generous husband. This sorrow must surely then have arisen from some sudden discovery, it was, no doubt, a sorrow associated with disgrace. Robert Audley understood the meaning of that vivid blush. You will offer to accompany your father wherever he may choose to go, Alicia, he said. You are his natural comforter at such a time as this, but you will best befriend him in this hour of trial by avoiding all intrusion upon his grief. Your very ignorance of the particulars of that grief will be a security for your discretion. Say nothing to your father that you might not have said to him 2 years ago, before he married a second wife. Try and be to him what you were before the woman in yonder room came between you and your father's love. I will, murmured Alicia, I will. You will naturally avoid all mention of Lady Audley's name. If your father is often silent, be patient. If it sometimes seems to you that the shadow of this great sorrow will never pass away from his life, be patient still. And remember that there can be no better hope of a cure of his grief than the hope that his daughter's devotion may lead him to remember there is one woman upon this earth who will love him truly and purely until the last. Yes, yes, Robert, dear cousin, I will remember. Mr. Audley, for the first time since he had been a schoolboy, took his cousin in his arms and kissed her broad forehead. My dear Alicia, he said, do this and you will make me happy. I have been in some measure the means of bringing this sorrow upon your father. Let me hope that it is not an enduring one. Try and restore my uncle to happiness, Alicia, and I will love you more dearly than brother ever loved a noble-hearted sister. And a brotherly affection may be worth having, perhaps, after all, my dear, though it is very different to poor Sir Harry's enthusiastic worship. Alicia's head was bent and her face hidden from her cousin while he spoke, but she lifted her head when he had finished, and looked him full in the face with a smile that was only the brighter for her eyes being filled with tears. You are a good fellow, Bob, she said, and I've been very foolish and wicked to feel angry with you because... The young lady stopped suddenly. Because what, my dear? Asked Mr. Audley. Because I'm silly, cousin Robert, Alicia said, quickly. Never mind that, Bob, I'll do all you wish, and it shall not be my fault if my dearest father doesn't forget his troubles before long. I'd go to the end of the world with him, poor darling, if I thought there was any comfort to be found for him in the journey. I'll go and get ready directly. Do you think Papa will go tonight? Yes, my dear, I don't think Sir Michael will rest another night under this roof yet awhile. The mail goes at 9:20, said Alicia. We must leave the house in an hour if we are to travel by it. I shall see you again before we go, Robert. Yes, dear. Miss Audley ran off to her room to summon her maid, and make all necessary preparations for the sudden journey, of whose ultimate destination she was as yet quite ignorant. She went heart and soul into the carrying out of the duty which Robert had dictated to her. She assisted in the packing of her portmanteaus, and hopelessly bewildered her maid by stuffing silk dresses into her bonnet boxes and satin shoes into her dressing case. She roamed about her rooms, gathering together drawing materials, music books, needlework, hairbrushes, jewelry, and perfume bottles. Very much as she might have done had she been about to sail for some savage country, devoid of all civilized resources. She was thinking all the time of her father's unknown grief, and perhaps a little of the serious face and earnest voice which had that night revealed her cousin Robert to her in a new character. Mr. Audley went upstairs after his cousin, and found his way to Sir Michael's dressing-room. He knocked at the door and listened, heaven knows how anxiously, for the expected answer. There was a moment's pause, during which the young man's heart beat loud and fast, and then the door was opened by the baronet himself. Robert saw that his uncle's valet was already hard at work preparing for his master's hurried journey. Sir Michael came out into the corridor. "Have you anything more to say to me, Robert?" he asked, quietly. "I only came to ascertain if I could assist in any of your arrangements. You go to London by the mail?" "Yes." "Have you any idea of where you will stay?" "Yes, I shall stop at the Clarendon, I am known there." "Is that all you have to say?" "Yes, except that Alicia will accompany you." "Alicia? She could not very well stay here, you know, just now. It would be best for her to leave the court until—" "Yes, yes, I understand," interrupted the baronet. "But is there nowhere else that she could go? Must she be with me?" "She could go nowhere else so immediately, and she would not be happy anywhere else." "Let her come, then," said Sir Michael, "let her come." He spoke in a strange, subdued voice, and with an apparent effort, as if it were painful to him to have to speak at all. As if all this ordinary business of life were a cruel torture to him, and jarred so much upon his grief as to be almost worse to bear than that grief itself. "Very well, my dear uncle, then all is arranged. Alicia will be ready to start at 9 o'clock. "Very good," muttered the baronet. "Let her come if she pleases, poor child, let her come." He sighed heavily as he spoke in that half-pitying tone of his daughter. He was thinking how comparatively indifferent he had been toward that only child for the sake of the woman now shut in the firelit room below. "I shall see you again before you go, sir," said Robert. "I will leave you till then." "Stay," said Sir Michael, suddenly, "have you told Alicia?" "I have told her nothing, except that you are about to leave the court for some time." "You are very good, my boy, you are very good," the baronet murmured in a broken voice. He stretched out his hand. His nephew took it in both his own, and pressed it to his lips. "Oh, sir! How can I ever forgive myself?" he said. "How can I ever cease to hate myself for having brought this grief upon you? No, no, Robert, you did right. I wish that God had been so merciful to me as to take my miserable life before this night, but you did right." Sir Michael re-entered his dressing-room, and Robert slowly returned to the vestibule. He paused upon the threshold of that chamber in which he had left Lucy, Lady Audley, otherwise Helen Talboys, the wife of his lost friend. She was lying upon the floor, upon the very spot in which she had crouched at her husband's feet telling her guilty story. Whether she was in a swoon, or whether she lay there in the utter helplessness of her misery, Robert scarcely cared to know. He went out into the vestibule, and sent one of the servants to look for her maid, the smart, beribboned damsel who was loud in wonder and consternation at the sight of her mistress. "Lady Audley is very ill," he said. "Take her to her room and see that she does not leave it tonight. You will be good enough to remain near her, but do not either talk to her or suffer her to excite herself by talking." My lady had not fainted. She allowed the girl to assist her, and rose from the ground upon which she had grovelled. Her golden hair fell in loose, disheveled masses about her ivory throat and shoulders, her face and lips were colorless, her eyes terrible in their unnatural light. "Take me away," she said, "and let me sleep. Let me sleep, for my brain is on fire." As she was leaving the room with her maid, she turned and looked at Robert. "Is Sir Michael gone?" she asked. "He will leave in half an hour." There were no lives lost in the fire at Mount Stanning? None. I am glad of that. The landlord of the house, Marks, was very terribly burned, and lies in a precarious state at his mother's cottage, but he may recover. I am glad of that. I am glad no life was lost. Good night, Mr. Audley. I shall ask to see you for half an hour's conversation in the course of tomorrow, my lady. Whenever you please. Good night. Good night. She went away quietly, leaning upon her maid's shoulder, and leaving Robert with a sense of strange bewilderment that was very painful to him. He sat down by the broad hearth upon which the red embers were fading, and wondered at the change in that old house which, until the day of his friend's disappearance, had been so pleasant a home for all who sheltered beneath its hospitable roof. He sat brooding over the desolate hearth, and trying to decide upon what must be done in this sudden crisis. He sat helpless and powerless to determine upon any course of action, lost in a dull reverie, from which he was aroused by the sound of carriage wheels driving up to the little turret entrance. The clock in the vestibule struck 9 as Robert opened the library door. Alicia had just descended the stairs with her maid, a rosy-faced country girl. "Goodbye, Robert," said Miss Audley, holding out her hand to her cousin. "Goodbye, and God bless you. You may trust me to take care of Papa." "I am sure I may." "God bless you, my dear." For the second time that night Robert Audley pressed his lips to his cousin's candid forehead, and for the second time the embrace was of a brotherly or paternal character, rather than the rapturous proceeding which it would have been had Sir Harry Towers been the privileged performer. It was 5 minutes past 9 when Sir Michael came downstairs, followed by his valet, grave and grey-haired like himself. The baronet was pale, but calm and self-possessed. The hand which he gave to his nephew was as cold as ice, but it was with a steady voice that he bade the young man good-bye. "I leave all in your hands, Robert," he said, as he turned to leave the house in which he had lived so long. "I may not have heard the end, but I have heard enough. Heaven knows I have no need to hear more. I leave all to you, but you will not be cruel, you will remember how much I loved." His voice broke huskily before he could finish the sentence. "I will remember you in everything, sir," the young man answered. "I will do everything for the best." A treacherous mist of tears blinded him and shut out his uncle's face, and in another minute the carriage had driven away, and Robert Audley sat alone in the dark library, where only one red spark glowed among the pale grey ashes. He sat alone, trying to think what he ought to do, and with the awful responsibility of a wicked woman's fate upon his shoulders. "Good heaven," he thought. "Surely this must be God's judgment upon the purposeless, vacillating life I led up to the 7th day of last September. Surely this awful responsibility has been forced upon me in order that I may humble myself to an offended providence, and confess that a man cannot choose his own life. He cannot say, 'I will take existence lightly, and keep out of the way of the wretched, mistaken, energetic creatures, who fight so heartily in the great battle.' He cannot say, 'I will stop in the tents while the strife is fought, and laugh at the fools who are trampled down in the useless struggle.' He cannot do this. He can only do, humbly and fearfully, that which the Maker who created him has appointed for him to do. If he has a battle to fight, let him fight it faithfully. But woe betide him if he skulks when his name is called in the mighty muster roll, woe betide him if he hides in the tents when the tocsin summons him to the scene of war." One of the servants brought candles into the library and relighted the fire, but Robert Audley did not stir from his seat by the hearth. He sat as he had often sat in his chambers in Fig Tree Court, with his elbows resting upon the arms of his chair, and his chin upon his hand. But he lifted his head as the servant was about to leave the room. "Can I send a message from here to London?" he asked. "It can be sent from Brentwood, sir, not from here." Mr. Audley looked at his watch thoughtfully. "One of the men can ride over to Brentwood, sir, if you wish any message to be sent." "I do wish to send a message." "Will you manage it for me, Richards?" "Certainly, sir." "You can wait, then, while I write the message." "Yes, sir." The man brought writing materials from one of the side tables, and placed them before Mr. Audley. Robert dipped a pen in the ink, and stared thoughtfully at one of the candles for a few moments before he began to write. The message ran thus. From Robert Audley, of Audley Court, Essex, to Francis Wilmington, of Paper Buildings, Temple. Dear Wilmington, if you know any physician experienced in cases of mania, and to be trusted with a secret, be so good as to send me his address by telegraph. Mr. Audley sealed this document in a stout envelope, and handed it to the man, with a sovereign. "You will see that this is given to a trustworthy person, Richards," he said, "and let the man wait at the station for the return message. He ought to get it in an hour and a half." Mr. Richards, who had known Robert Audley in jackets and turn-down collars, departed to execute his commission. Heaven forbid that we should follow him into the comfortable servants' hall at the court, where the household sat round the blazing fire, discussing in utter bewilderment the events of the day. Nothing could be wider from the truth than the speculations of these worthy people. What clue had they to the mystery of that firelit room in which a guilty woman had knelt at their master's feet to tell the story of her sinful life? They only knew that which Sir Michael's valet had told them of this sudden journey. How his master was as pale as a sheet, and spoke in a strange voice that didn't sound like his own, somehow, and how you might have knocked him, Mr. Parsons, the valet, down with a feather, if you had been minded to prostrate him by the aid of so feeble a weapon. The wise heads of the servants' hall decided that Sir Michael had received sudden intelligence through Mr. Robert. They were wise enough to connect the young man with the catastrophe, either of the death of some near and dear relation. The elder servants decimated the Audley family in their endeavors to find a likely relation, or of some alarming fall in the funds, or of the failure of some speculation or bank in which the greater part of the baronet's money was invested. The general leaning was toward the failure of a bank, and every member of the assembly seemed to take a dismal and raven-like delight in the fancy. Though such a supposition involved their own ruin in the general destruction of that liberal household. Robert sat by the dreary hearth, which seemed dreary even now when the blaze of a great wood fire roared in the wide chimney, and listened to the low wail of the March wind moaning round the house and lifting the shivering ivy from the walls it sheltered. He was tired and worn out, for remember that he had been awakened from his sleep at 2 o'clock that morning by the hot breath of blazing timber and the sharp crackling of burning woodwork. But for his presence of mind and cool decision, Mr. Luke Marks would have died a dreadful death. He still bore the traces of the night's peril, for the dark hair had been singed upon one side of his forehead, and his left hand was red and inflamed, from the effect of the scorching atmosphere out of which he had dragged the landlord of the castle in. He was thoroughly exhausted with fatigue and excitement, and he fell into a heavy sleep in his easy chair before the bright fire, from which he was only awakened by the entrance of Mr. Richards with the return message. This return message was very brief. Dear Audley, always glad to oblige. Alwyn Mosgrave, M.D., 12 Savile Row. Safe. This with names and addresses, was all that it contained. I shall want another message taken to Brentwood tomorrow morning, Richards, said Mr. Audley, as he folded the telegram. I should be glad if the man would ride over with it before breakfast. He shall have half a sovereign for his trouble. Mr. Richards bowed. Thank you, sir, not necessary, sir, but as you please, of course, sir, he murmured. At what hour might you wish the man to go? Mr. Audley might wish the man to go as early as he could, so it was decided that he should go at 6. My room is ready, I suppose, Richards? Said Robert. Yes, sir, your old room. Very good. I shall go to bed at once. Bring me a glass of brandy and water as hot as you can make it, and wait for the telegram. This second message was only a very earnest request to Dr. Mosgrave to pay an immediate visit to Audley Court on a matter of serious moment. Having written this message, Mr. Audley felt that he had done all that he could do. He drank his brandy and water. He had actual need of the diluted alcohol, for he had been chilled to the bone by his adventures during the fire. He slowly sipped the pale golden liquid and thought of Clara Talboys, of that earnest girl whose brother's memory was now avenged, whose brother's destroyer was humiliated in the dust. Had she heard of the fire at the Castle Inn? How could she have done otherwise than hear of it in such a place as Mount Stanning? But had she heard that he had been in danger, and that he had distinguished himself by the rescue of a drunken boor? I fear that, even sitting by that desolate hearth, and beneath the roof whose noble was an exile from his own house, Robert Audley was weak enough to think of these things, weak enough to let his fancy wander away to the dismal fir trees under the cold March sky. And the dark brown eyes that were so like the eyes of his lost friend. Chapter 36. Dr. Mosgrave's Advice. My lady slept. Through that long winter night she slept soundly. Criminals have often so slept their last sleep upon earth, and have been found in the grey morning slumbering peacefully, by the jailer who came to wake them. The game had been played and lost. I do not think that my lady had thrown away a card, or missed the making of a trick which she might by any possibility have made. But her opponent's hand had been too powerful for her, and he had won. She looked upon herself as a species of state prisoner, who would have to be taken good care of. A second Iron Mask, who must be provided for in some comfortable place of confinement. She abandoned herself to a dull indifference. She had lived 100 lives within the space of the last few days of her existence, and she had worn out her capacity for suffering, for a time at least. She ate her breakfast, and took her morning bath, and emerged, with perfumed hair and in the most exquisitely careless of morning toilets, from her luxurious dressing-room. She looked at herself in the cheval-glass before she left the room. A long night's rest had brought back the delicate rose tints of her complexion, and the natural luster of her blue eyes. That unnatural light which had burned so fearfully the day before had gone, and my lady smiled triumphantly as she contemplated the reflection of her beauty. The days were gone in which her enemies could have branded her with white-hot irons, and burned away the loveliness which had done such mischief. Whatever they did to her they must leave her her beauty, she thought. At the worst, they were powerless to rob her of that. The March day was bright and sunny, with a cheerless sunshine certainly. My lady wrapped herself in an Indian shawl, a shawl that had cost Sir Michael 100 guineas. I think she had an idea that it would be well to wear this costly garment, so that if hustled suddenly away, she might carry at least one of her possessions with her. Remember how much she had periled for a fine house and gorgeous furniture, for carriages and horses, jewels and laces. And do not wonder if she clings with a desperate tenacity to gauds and gewgaws, in the hour of her despair. If she had been Judas, she would have held to her 30 pieces of silver to the last moment of her shameful life. Mr. Robert Audley breakfasted in the library. He sat long over his solitary cup of tea, smoking his meerschaum pipe, and meditating darkly upon the task that lay before him. I will appeal to the experience of this Dr. Mosgrave, he thought. Physicians and lawyers are the confessors of this prosaic 19th century. Surely, he will be able to help me. The first fast train from London arrived at Audley at 10:30 o'clock, and at 5 minutes before 11, Richards, the grave servant, announced Dr. Alwyn Mosgrave. The physician from Savile Row was a tall man of about 50 years of age. He was thin and sallow, with lantern jaws, and eyes of a pale, feeble grey, that seemed as if they had once been blue, and had faded by the progress of time to their present neutral shade. However powerful the science of medicine as wielded by Dr. Alwyn Mosgrave, it had not been strong enough to put flesh upon his bones, or brightness into his face. He had a strangely expressionless, and yet strangely attentive countenance. He had the face of a man who had spent the greater part of his life in listening to other people, and who had parted with his own individuality and his own passions at the very outset of his career. He bowed to Robert Audley, took the opposite seat indicated by him, and addressed his attentive face to the young barrister. Robert saw that the physician's glance for a moment lost its quiet look of attention, and became earnest and searching. "He is wondering whether I am the patient," thought Mr. Audley, "and is looking for the diagnoses of madness in my face." Dr. Mosgrave spoke as if in answer to this thought. "Is it not about your own health that you wish to consult me?" he said, interrogatively. "Oh, no. Dar." Mosgrave looked at his watch, a 50-guinea Benson-made chronometer, which he carried loose in his waistcoat pocket as carelessly as if it had been a potato. "I need not remind you that my time is precious," he said. "Your telegram informed me that my services were required in a case of danger, as I apprehend, or I should not be here this morning." Robert Audley had sat looking gloomily at the fire, wondering how he should begin the conversation, and had needed this reminder of the physician's presence. "You are very good, Dr. Mosgrave," he said, rousing himself by an effort, "and I thank you very much for having responded to my summons. I am about to appeal to you upon a subject which is more painful to me than words can describe. I am about to implore your advice in a most difficult case, and I trust almost blindly to your experience to rescue me, and others who are very dear to me, from a cruel and complicated position." The businesslike attention in Dr. Mosgrave's face grew into a look of interest as he listened to Robert Audley. "The revelation made by the patient to the physician is, I believe, as sacred as the confession of a penitent to his priest?" Robert asked, gravely. "Quite as sacred. A solemn confidence, to be violated under no circumstances?" "Most certainly." Robert Audley looked at the fire again. How much should he tell, or how little, of the dark history of his uncle's second wife? "I have been given to understand, Dr. Mosgrave, that you have devoted much of your attention to the treatment of insanity." "Yes, my practice is almost confined to the treatment of mental diseases." "Such being the case, I think I may venture to conclude that you sometimes receive strange, and even terrible, revelations." Dr. Mosgrave bowed. He looked like a man who could have carried, safely locked in his passionless breast, the secrets of a nation, and who would have suffered no inconvenience from the weight of such a burden. "The story which I am about to tell you is not my own story," said Robert, after a pause. "You will forgive me, therefore, if I once more remind you that I can only reveal it upon the understanding that under no circumstances, or upon no apparent justification. Is that confidence to be betrayed?" Dr. Mosgrave bowed again. A little sternly, perhaps, this time. "I am all attention, Mr. Audley," he said coldly. Robert Audley drew his chair nearer to that of the physician, and in a low voice began the story which my lady had told upon her knees in that same chamber upon the previous night. Dr. Mosgrave's listening face, turned always toward the speaker, betrayed no surprise at that strange revelation. He smiled once, a grave, quiet smile, when Mr. Audley came to that part of the story which told of the conspiracy at Ventnor, but he was not surprised. Robert Audley ended his story at the point at which Sir Michael Audley had interrupted my lady's confession. He told nothing of the disappearance of George Talboys, nor of the horrible suspicions that had grown out of that disappearance. He told nothing of the fire at the Castle Inn. Dr. Mosgrave shook his head, gravely, when Mr. Audley came to the end of his story. "You have nothing further to tell me?" he said. "No. I do not think there is anything more that need be told," Robert answered, rather evasively. "You would wish to prove that this lady is mad, and therefore irresponsible for her actions, Mr. Audley?" said the physician. Robert Audley stared, wondering at the mad doctor. By what process had he so rapidly arrived at the young man's secret desire? "Yes, I would rather, if possible, think her mad. I should be glad to find that excuse for her. And to save the esclandre of a chancery suit, I suppose, Mr. Audley," said Dr. Mosgrave. Robert shuddered as he bowed in assent to this remark. It was something worse than a chancery suit that he dreaded with a horrible fear. It was a trial for murder that had so long haunted his dreams. How often he had awoke, in an agony of shame, from a vision of a crowded courthouse, and his uncle's wife in a criminal dock, hemmed in on every side by a sea of eager faces. "I fear that I shall not be of any use to you," the physician said, quietly. "I will see the lady, if you please, but I do not believe that she is mad." "Why not?" "Because there is no evidence of madness in anything she has done. She ran away from her home, because her home was not a pleasant one, and she left in the hope of finding a better. There is no madness in that. She committed the crime of bigamy, because by that crime she obtained fortune and position. There is no madness there. When she found herself in a desperate position, she did not grow desperate. She employed intelligent means, and she carried out a conspiracy which required coolness and deliberation in its execution. There is no madness in that. But the traits of hereditary insanity may descend to the third generation, and appear in the lady's children, if she have any. Madness is not necessarily transmitted from mother to daughter. I should be glad to help you, if I could, Mr. Audley, but I do not think there is any proof of insanity in the story you have told me. I do not think any jury in England would accept the plea of insanity in such a case as this. The best thing you can do with this lady is to send her back to her first husband, if he will have her." Robert started at this sudden mention of his friend. "Her first husband is dead," he answered, "at least, he has been missing for some time, and I have reason to believe that he is dead." Dar. Mosgrave saw the startled movement, and heard the embarrassment in Robert Audley's voice as he spoke of George Talboys. "The lady's first husband is missing," he said, with a strange emphasis on the word. "You think that he is dead?" He paused for a few moments and looked at the fire, as Robert had looked before. "Mr. Audley," he said, presently, "there must be no half-confidences between us. You have not told me all." Robert, looking up suddenly, plainly expressed in his face the surprise he felt at these words. "I should be very poorly able to meet the contingencies of my professional experience," said Dr. Mosgrave, "if I could not perceive where confidence ends and reservation begins. You have only told me half this lady's story, Mr. Audley. You must tell me more before I can offer you any advice. What has become of the first husband?" He asked this question in a decisive tone, as if he knew it to be the keystone of an arch. "I have already told you, Dr. Mosgrave, that I do not know." "Yes," answered the physician, "but your face has told me what you have withheld from me. It has told me that you suspect." Robert Audley was silent. "If I am to be of use to you, you must trust me, Mr. Audley," said the physician. "The first husband disappeared, how and when?" "I want to know the history of his disappearance." Robert paused for some time before he replied to this speech, but, by and by, he lifted his head, which had been bent in an attitude of earnest thought, and addressed the physician. "I will trust you, Dr. Mosgrave," he said. "I will confide entirely in your honor and goodness. I do not ask you to do any wrong to society. But I ask you to save our stainless name from degradation and shame, if you can do so conscientiously." He told the story of George's disappearance, and of his own doubts and fears, heaven knows how reluctantly. Dr. Mosgrave listened as quietly as he had listened before. Robert concluded with an earnest appeal to the physician's best feelings. He implored him to spare the generous old man whose fatal confidence in a wicked woman had brought much misery upon his declining years. It was impossible to draw any conclusion, either favorable or otherwise, from Dr. Mosgrave's attentive face. He rose, when Robert had finished speaking, and looked at his watch once more. "I can only spare you 20 minutes, he said. "I will see the lady, if you please." "You say her mother died in a madhouse?" "She did." "Will you see Lady Audley alone?" "Yes, alone, if you please." Robert rung for my lady's maid, and under convoy of that smart young damsel the physician found his way to the octagon antechamber, and the fairy boudoir with which it communicated. 10 minutes afterward, he returned to the library, in which Robert sat waiting for him. "I have talked to the lady," he said, quietly, "and we understand each other very well. There is latent insanity. Insanity which might never appear, or which might appear only once or twice in a lifetime. It would be a dementia in its worst phase, perhaps, acute mania. But its duration would be very brief, and it would only arise under extreme mental pressure. The lady is not mad, but she has the hereditary taint in her blood. She has the cunning of madness, with the prudence of intelligence. I will tell you what she is, Mr. Audley. She is dangerous." Gar. Mosgrave walked up and down the room once or twice before he spoke again. "I will not discuss the probabilities of the suspicion which distresses you, Mr. Audley," he said, presently, "but I will tell you this much, I do not advise any esclandre. This Mr. George Talboys has disappeared, but you have no evidence of his death. If you could produce evidence of his death, you could produce no evidence against this lady, beyond the one fact that she had a powerful motive for getting rid of him. No jury in the United Kingdom would condemn her upon such evidence as that." Robert Audley interrupted Dr. Mosgrave, hastily. "I assure you, my dear sir," he said, "that my greatest fear is the necessity of any exposure, any disgrace." "Certainly, Mr. Audley," answered the physician, coolly, "but you cannot expect me to assist you to condone one of the worst offences against society. If I saw adequate reason for believing that a murder had been committed by this woman, I should refuse to assist you in smuggling her away out of the reach of justice. Although the honour of 100 noble families might be saved by my doing so. But I do not see adequate reason for your suspicions, and I will do my best to help you." Robert Audley grasped the physician's hands in both his own. "I will thank you when I am better able to do so," he said, with emotion. "I will thank you in my uncle's name as well as in my own." "I have only 5 minutes more, and I have a letter to write," said Dr. Mosgrave, smiling at the young man's energy. He seated himself at a writing table in the window, dipped his pen in the ink, and wrote rapidly for about 7 minutes. He had filled 3 sides of a sheet of notepaper, when he threw down his pen and folded his letter. He put this letter into an envelope, and delivered it, unsealed, to Robert Audley. The address which it bore was Monsieur Val, Villabrumius, Belgium. Mr. Audley looked rather doubtfully from this address to the doctor, who was putting on his gloves as deliberately as if his life had never known a more solemn purpose than the proper adjustment of them. "That letter," he said, in answer to Robert Audley's inquiring look, "is written to my friend Monsieur Val, the proprietor and medical superintendent of a very excellent maison de santé in the town of Villabrumius. We have known each other for many years, and he will no doubt willingly receive Lady Audley into his establishment, and charge himself with the full responsibility of her future life. It will not be a very eventful one." Robert Audley would have spoken, he would have once more expressed his gratitude for the help which had been given to him, but Dr. Mosgrave checked him with an authoritative gesture. "From the moment in which Lady Audley enters that house," he said, "her life, so far as life is made up of action and variety, will be finished. Whatever secrets she may have will be secrets forever. Whatever crimes she may have committed she will be able to commit no more. If you were to dig a grave for her in the nearest churchyard and bury her alive in it, you could not more safely shut her from the world and all worldly associations. But as a physiologist and as an honest man, I believe you could do no better service to society than by doing this. For physiology is a lie if the woman I saw 10 minutes ago is a woman to be trusted at large. If she could have sprung at my throat and strangled me with her little hands, as I sat talking to her just now, she would have done it. She suspected your purpose, then. She knew it. You think I am mad like my mother, and you have come to question me, she said. You are watching for some sign of the dreadful taint in my blood. Good day to you, Mr. Audley, the physician added hurriedly, my time was up 10 minutes ago, it is as much as I shall do to catch the train. Chapter 37. Buried alive. Robert Audley sat alone in the library with the physician's letter upon the table before him, thinking of the work which was still to be done. The young barrister had constituted himself the denouncer of this wretched woman. He had been her judge, and he was now her jailer. Not until he had delivered the letter which lay before him to its proper address, not until he had given up his charge into the safe keeping of the foreign madhouse doctor. Not until then would the dreadful burden be removed from him and his duty done. He wrote a few lines to my lady, telling her that he was going to carry her away from Audley Court to a place from which she was not likely to return, and requesting her to lose no time in preparing for the journey. He wished to start that evening, if possible, he told her. Miss Susan Martin, the lady's maid, thought it a very hard thing to have to pack her mistress' trunks in such a hurry, but my lady assisted in the task. She toiled resolutely in directing and assisting her servant, who scented bankruptcy and ruin in all this packing up and hurrying away, and was therefore rather languid and indifferent in the discharge of her duties. And at 6 o'clock in the evening she sent her attendant to tell Mr. Audley that she was ready to depart as soon as he pleased. Robert had consulted a volume of Bradshaw, and had discovered that Villebrumeus lay out of the track of all railway traffic, and was only approachable by diligence from Brussels. The mail for Dover left London Bridge at 9 o'clock, and could be easily caught by Robert and his charge, as the 7 o'clock up train from Audley reached Shoreditch at 8:15. Travelling by the Dover and Calais route, they would reach Villebrumeus by the following afternoon or evening. It was late in the afternoon of the next day when the diligence bumped and rattled over the uneven paving of the principal street in Villebrumeus. Robert Audley and my lady had had the coupe of the diligence to themselves for the whole of the journey, for there were not many travellers between Brussels and Villebrumeus, and the public conveyance was supported by the force of tradition rather than any great profit attaching to it as a speculation. My lady had not spoken during the journey, except to decline some refreshments which Robert had offered her at a halting place upon the road. Her heart sunk when they left Brussels behind, for she had hoped that city might have been the end of her journey, and she had turned with a feeling of sickness and despair from the dull Belgian landscape. She looked up at last as the vehicle jolted into a great stony quadrangle, which had been the approach to a monastery once, but which was now the courtyard of a dismal hotel, in whose cellars legions of rats skirmished and squeaked even while the broad sunshine was bright in the chambers above. Lady Audley shuddered as she alighted from the diligence, and found herself in that dreary courtyard. Robert was surrounded by chattering porters, who clamoured for his baggages, and disputed among themselves as to the hotel at which he was to rest. One of these men ran away to fetch a hackney coach at Mr. Audley's behest, and reappeared presently, urging on a pair of horses, which were so small as to suggest the idea that they had been made out of one ordinary-sized animal, with wild shrieks and whoops that had a demoniac sound in the darkness. Mr. Audley left my lady in a dreary coffee-room in the care of a drowsy attendant while he drove away to some distant part of the quiet city. There was official business to be gone through before Sir Michael's wife could be quietly put away in the place suggested by Dr. Mosgrave. Robert had to see all manner of important personages, and to take numerous oaths, and to exhibit the English physician's letter, and to go through much ceremony of signing and countersigning before he could take his lost friend's cruel wife to the home which was to be her last upon earth. Upward of 2 hours elapsed before all this was arranged, and the young man was free to return to the hotel, where he found his charge staring absently at a pair of wax candles, with a cup of untasted coffee standing cold and stagnant before her. Robert handed my lady into the hired vehicle, and took his seat opposite to her once more. "Where are you going to take me?" she asked, at last. "I am tired of being treated like some naughty child, who is put into a dark cellar as a punishment for its offences." "Where are you taking me?" "To a place in which you will have ample leisure to repent the past, Mrs. Talboys," Robert answered, gravely. They had left the paved streets behind them, and had emerged out of a great gaunt square, in which there appeared to be about half a dozen cathedrals, into a small boulevard, a broad lamplit road, on which the shadows of the leafless branches went and came tremblingly, like the shadows of a paralytic skeleton. There were houses here and there upon this boulevard, stately houses, entrée cour et jardin, and with plaster vases of geraniums on the stone pillars of the ponderous gateways. The rumbling hackney carriage drove upward of 3/4 of a mile along this smooth roadway before it drew up against a gateway, older and more ponderous than any of those they had passed. My lady gave a little scream as she looked out of the coach window. The gaunt gateway was lighted by an enormous lamp, a great structure of iron and glass, in which one poor little shivering flame struggled with the March wind. The coachman rang the bell, and a little wooden door at the side of the gate was opened by a grey-haired man, who looked out at the carriage, and then retired. He reappeared 3 minutes afterward behind the folding iron gates, which he unlocked and threw back to their full extent, revealing a dreary desert of stone-paved courtyard. The coachman led his wretched horses into the courtyard, and piloted the vehicle to the principal doorway of the house, a great mansion of grey stone, with several long ranges of windows, many of which were dimly lighted, and looked out like the pale eyes of weary watchers upon the darkness of the night. My lady, watchful and quiet as the cold stars in the wintry sky, looked up at these casements with an earnest and scrutinizing gaze. One of the windows was shrouded by a scanty curtain of faded red, and upon this curtain there went and came a dark shadow, the shadow of a woman with a fantastic head dress, the shadow of a restless creature, who paced perpetually backward and forward before the window. Sir Michael Audley's wicked wife laid her hand suddenly upon Robert's arm, and pointed with the other hand to this curtained window. "I know where you have brought me," she said. "This is a madhouse." Mr. Audley did not answer her. He had been standing at the door of the coach when she addressed him, and he quietly assisted her to alight, and led her up a couple of shallow stone steps, and into the entrance hall of the mansion. He handed Dr. Mosgrave's letter to a neatly dressed, cheerful-looking, middle-aged woman, who came tripping out of a little chamber which opened out of the hall, and was very much like the bureau of an hotel. This person smilingly welcomed Robert and his charge, and after dispatching a servant with the letter, invited them into her pleasant little apartment, which was gaily furnished with bright amber curtains and heated by a tiny stove. "Madame finds herself very much fatigued," the Frenchwoman said, interrogatively, with a look of intense sympathy, as she placed an armchair for my lady. Madame shrugged her shoulders wearily, and looked round the little chamber with a sharp glance of scrutiny that betokened no very great favor. "What is this place, Robert Audley?" she cried fiercely. "Do you think I am a baby, that you may juggle with and deceive me? What is it?" "It is what I said just now, is it not?" "It is a maison de santé, my lady," the young man answered, gravely. "I have no wish to juggle with or to deceive you." My lady paused for a few moments, looking reflectively at Robert. "A maison de santé," she repeated. "Yes, they manage these things better in France. In England we should call it a madhouse. This a house for mad people, this, is it not, madam?" she said in French, turning upon the woman, and tapping the polished floor with her foot. "Ah, but no, madam," the woman answered with a shrill scream of protest. "It is an establishment of the most agreeable, where one amuses one's self." She was interrupted by the entrance of the principal of this agreeable establishment, who came beaming into the room with a radiant smile illuminating his countenance, and with Dr. Mosgrave's letter open in his hand. It was impossible to say how enchanted he was to make the acquaintance of Monsieur. There was nothing upon earth which he was not ready to do for Monsieur in his own person, and nothing under heaven which he would not strive to accomplish for him, as the friend of his acquaintance. So very much distinguished, the English doctor. Dr. Mosgrave's letter had given him a brief synopsis of the case, he informed Robert, in an undertone. And he was quite prepared to undertake the care of the charming and very interesting madam. He rubbed his hands politely, and looked at Robert. Mr. Audley remembered, for the first time, that he had been recommended to introduce his wretched charge under a feigned name. He affected not to hear the proprietor's question. It might seem a very easy matter to have hit upon a heap of names, any one of which would have answered his purpose. But Mr. Audley appeared suddenly to have forgotten that he had ever heard any mortal appellation except that of himself and of his lost friend. Perhaps the proprietor perceived and understood his embarrassment. He at any rate relieved it by turning to the woman who had received them, and muttering something about number 14, bis. The woman took a key from a long range of others, that hung over the mantelpiece, and a wax candle from a bracket in a corner of the room, and having lighted the candle, led the way across the stone-paved hall, and up a broad, slippery staircase of polished wood. The English physician had informed his Belgian colleague that money would be of minor consequence in any arrangements made for the comfort of the English lady who was to be committed to his care. Acting upon this hint, Monsieur Val opened the outer door of a stately suite of apartments, which included a lobby, paved with alternate diamonds of black and white marble, but of a dismal and cellar-like darkness. A saloon furnished with gloomy velvet draperies, and with a certain funereal splendor which is not peculiarly conducive to the elevation of the spirits. And a bedchamber, containing a bed so wondrously made, as to appear to have no opening whatever in its coverings, unless the counterpane had been split asunder with a penknife. My lady stared dismally round at the range of rooms, which looked dreary enough in the wan light of a single wax candle. This solitary flame, pale and ghostlike in itself, was multiplied by paler phantoms of its ghostliness, which glimmered everywhere about the rooms. In the shadowy depths of the polished floors and wainscot, or the window-panes, in the looking-glasses, or in those great expanses of glimmering something which adorned the rooms, and which my lady mistook for costly mirrors, but which were in reality wretched mockeries of burnished tin. Amid all the faded splendor of shabby velvet, and tarnished gilding, and polished wood, the woman dropped into an armchair, and covered her face with her hands. The whiteness of them, and the starry light of diamonds trembling about them, glittered in the dimly lighted chamber. She sat silent, motionless, despairing, sullen, and angry, while Robert and the French doctor retired to an outer chamber, and talked together in undertones. Mr. Audley had very little to say that had not been already said for him, with a far better grace than he himself could have expressed it, by the English physician. He had, after great trouble of mind, hit upon the name of Taylor, as a safe and simple substitute for that other name, to which alone my lady had a right. He told the Frenchman that this Mrs. Taylor was distantly related to him, that she had inherited the seeds of madness from her mother, as indeed Dr. Mosgrave had informed Monsieur Val, and that she had shown some fearful tokens of the lurking taint that was latent in her mind, but that she was not to be called mad. He begged that she might be treated with all tenderness and compassion, that she might receive all reasonable indulgences. But he impressed upon Monsieur Val, that under no circumstances was she to be permitted to leave the house and grounds without the protection of some reliable person, who should be answerable for her safe keeping. He had only one other point to urge, and that was, that Monsieur Val, who, as he had understood, was himself a Protestant, the doctor bowed, would make arrangements with some kind and benevolent Protestant clergyman, through whom spiritual advice and consolation might be secured for the invalid lady, who had a special need, Robert added, gravely, of such advantages. This, with all necessary arrangements as to pecuniary matters, which were to be settled from time to time between Mr. Audley and the doctor, unassisted by any agents whatever, was the extent of the conversation between the two men, and occupied about a quarter of an hour. My lady sat in the same attitude when they re-entered the bedchamber in which they had left her, with her ringed hands still clasped over her face. Robert bent over to whisper in her ear. "Your name is Madame Taylor here," he said. "I do not think you would wish to be known by your real name." She only shook her head in answer to him, and did not even remove her hands from over her face. "Madame will have an attendant entirely devoted to her service," said Monsieur Val. "Madame will have all her wishes obeyed, her reasonable wishes, but that goes without saying," Monsieur adds, with a quaint shrug. Every effort will be made to render Madame's sojourn at Villabrumius agreeable. The inmates dine together when it is wished. I dine with the inmates sometimes. My subordinate, a clever and a worthy man always. I reside with my wife and children in a little pavilion in the grounds, my subordinate resides in the establishment. Madame may rely upon our utmost efforts being exerted to ensure her comfort. Monsieur is saying a great deal more to the same effect, rubbing his hands and beaming radiantly upon Robert and his charge, when Madame rises suddenly, erect and furious. And dropping her jeweled fingers from before her face, tells him to hold his tongue. "Leave me alone with the man who has brought me here," she cried, between her set teeth. "Leave me." She points to the door with a sharp, imperious gesture. So rapid that the silken drapery about her arm makes a swooping sound as she lifts her hand. The sibilant French syllables hiss through her teeth as she utters them, and seem better fitted to her mood and to herself than the familiar English she has spoken hitherto. The French doctor shrugs his shoulders as he goes out into the lobby, and mutters something about a beautiful devil, and a gesture worthy of the Mars. My lady walked with a rapid footstep to the door between the bedchamber and the saloon, closed it, and with the handle of the door still in her hand, turned and looked at Robert Audley. "You have brought me to my grave, Mr. Audley," she cried. "You have used your power basely and cruelly, and have brought me to a living grave." "I have done that which I thought just to others and merciful to you," Robert answered, quietly. "I should have been a traitor to society had I suffered you to remain at liberty after the disappearance of George Talboys and the fire at Castle Inn. I have brought you to a place in which you will be kindly treated by people who have no knowledge of your story, no power to taunt or to reproach you. You will lead a quiet and peaceful life, my lady, such a life as many a good and holy woman in this Catholic country freely takes upon herself, and happily endures until the end. The solitude of your existence in this place will be no greater than that of a king's daughter, who, flying from the evil of the time, was glad to take shelter in a house as tranquil as this. Surely, it is a small atonement which I ask you to render for your sins, a light penance which I call upon you to perform. Live here and repent, nobody will assail you, nobody will torment you. I only say to you, repent." "I cannot," cried my lady, pushing her hair fiercely from her white forehead, and fixing her dilated eyes upon Robert Audley, "I cannot. Has my beauty brought me to this? Have I plotted and schemed to shield myself and laid awake in the long deadly nights, trembling to think of my dangers, for this? I had better have given up at once, since this was to be the end. I had better have yielded to the curse that was upon me, and given up when George Talboys first came back to England." She plucked at the feathery golden curls as if she would have torn them from her head. It had served her so little after all, that gloriously glittering hair, that beautiful nimbus of yellow light that had contrasted so exquisitely with the melting azure of her eyes. She hated herself and her beauty. "I would laugh at you and defy you, if I dared," she cried, "would kill myself and defy you, if I dared. But I am a poor, pitiful coward, and have been so from the first. Afraid of my mother's horrible inheritance, afraid of poverty, afraid of George Talboys, afraid of you." She was silent for a little while, but she held her place by the door, as if determined to detain Robert as long as it was her pleasure to do so. "Do you know what I am thinking of?" she said, presently. "Do you know what I am thinking of, as I look at you in the dim light of this room? I am thinking of the day upon which George Talboys disappeared." Robert started as she mentioned the name of his lost friend, his face turned pale in the dusky light, and his breathing grew quicker and louder. "He was standing opposite me, as you are standing now," continued my lady. "You said that you would raze the old house to the ground. That you would root up every tree in the gardens to find your dead friend. You would have had no need to do so much. The body of George Talboys lies at the bottom of the old well, in the shrubbery beyond the lime walk." Robert Audley flung his hands and clasped them above his head, with one loud cry of horror. "Oh, my God," he said, after a dreadful pause. "Have all the ghastly things that I have thought prepared me so little for the ghastly truth, that it should come upon me like this at last? He came to me in the lime walk, resumed my lady, in the same hard, dogged tone as that in which she had confessed the wicked story of her life. I knew that he would come, and I had prepared myself, as well as I could, to meet him. I was determined to bribe him, to cajole him, to defy him. To do anything sooner than abandon the wealth and the position I had won, and go back to my old life. He came, and he reproached me for the conspiracy at Ventnor. He declared that so long as he lived he would never forgive me for the lie that had broken his heart. He told me that I had plucked his heart out of his breast and trampled upon it. And that he had now no heart in which to feel one sentiment of mercy for me. That he would have forgiven me any wrong upon earth, but that one deliberate and passionless wrong that I had done him. He said this and a great deal more, and he told me that no power on earth should turn him from his purpose, which was to take me to the man I had deceived, and make me tell my wicked story. He did not know the hidden taint that I had sucked in with my mother's milk. He did not know that it was possible to drive me mad. He goaded me as you have goaded me. He was as merciless as you have been merciless. We were in the shrubbery at the end of the lime walk. I was seated upon the broken masonry at the mouth of the well. George Talboys was leaning upon the disused windlass, in which the rusty iron spindle rattled loosely whenever he shifted his position. I rose at last, and turned upon him to defy him, as I had determined to defy him at the worst. I told him that if he denounced me to Sir Michael, I would declare him to be a madman or a liar, and I defied him to convince the man who loved me, blindly, as I told him, that he had any claim to me. I was going to leave him after having told him this, when he caught me by the wrist and detained me by force. You saw the bruises that his fingers made upon my wrist, and noticed them, and did not believe the account I gave of them. I could see that, Mr. Robert Audley, and I saw that you were a person I should have to fear. She paused, as if she had expected Robert to speak. But he stood silent and motionless, waiting for the end. George Talboys treated me as you treated me, she said, petulantly. He swore that if there was but one witness of my identity, and that witness was removed from Audley Court by the width of the whole earth, he would bring him there to swear to my identity. And to denounce me. It was then that I was mad, it was then that I drew the loose iron spindle from the shrunken wood, and saw my first husband sink with one horrible cry into the black mouth of the well. There is a legend of its enormous depth. I do not know how deep it is. It is dry, I suppose, for I heard no splash, only a dull thud. I looked down and I saw nothing but black emptiness. I knelt down and listened, but the cry was not repeated, though I waited for nearly a quarter of an hour, God knows how long it seemed to me, by the mouth of the well. Robert Audley uttered a word of horror when the story was finished. He moved a little nearer toward the door against which Helen Talboys stood. Had there been any other means of exit from the room, he would gladly have availed himself of it. He shrank from even a momentary contact with this creature. "Let me pass you, if you please," he said, in an icy voice. "You see I do not fear to make my confession to you," said Helen Talboys, "for two reasons. The first is, that you dare not use it against me, because you know it would kill your uncle to see me in a criminal dock. The second is, that the law could pronounce no worse sentence than this, a lifelong imprisonment in a madhouse. You see I do not thank you for your mercy, Mr. Robert Audley, for I know exactly what it is worth." She moved away from the door, and Robert passed her without a word, without a look. Half an hour afterward he was in one of the principal hotels at Villabrumius, sitting at a neatly ordered supper table, with no power to eat. With no power to distract his mind, even for a moment, from the image of that lost friend who had been treacherously murdered in the thicket at Audley Court. Chapter 38. Ghost Haunted. No feverish sleeper traveling in a strange dream ever looked out more wonderingly upon a world that seemed unreal than Robert Audley. As he stared absently at the flat swamps and dismal poplars between Villabrumius and Brussels. Could it be that he was returning to his uncle's house without the woman who had reigned in it for nearly 2 years as queen and mistress? He felt as if he had carried off my lady, and had made away with her secretly and darkly, and must now render up an account to Sir Michael of the fate of that woman, whom the baronet had so dearly loved. What shall I tell him, he thought. Shall I tell the truth, the horrible, ghastly truth? No, that would be too cruel. His generous spirit would sink under the hideous revelation. Yet, in his ignorance of the extent of this wretched woman's wickedness, he may think, perhaps, that I have been hard with her. Brooding thus, Mr. Robert Audley absently watched the cheerless landscape from the seat in the shabby coupe of the diligence, and thought how great a leaf had been torn out of his life. Now that the dark story of George Talboys was finished, what had he to do next? A crowd of horrible thoughts rushed into his mind as he remembered the story that he had heard from the white lips of Helen Talboys. His friend, his murdered friend, lay hidden among the mouldering ruins of the old well at Audley Court. He had lain there for 6 long months, unburied, unknown. Hidden in the darkness of the old convent well. What was to be done? To institute a search for the remains of the murdered man was to inevitably bring about a coroner's inquest. Should such an inquest be held, it was next to impossible that the history of my lady's crime could fail to be brought to light. To prove that George Talboys met with his death at Audley Court, was to prove almost as surely that my lady had been the instrument of that mysterious death. For the young man had been known to follow her into the lime walk upon the day of his disappearance. My God! Robert exclaimed, as the full horror of his position became evident to him. Is my friend to rest in this unhallowed burial place because I have condoned the offences of the woman who murdered him? He felt that there was no way out of this difficulty. Sometimes he thought that it little mattered to his dead friend whether he lay entombed beneath a marble monument, whose workmanship should be the wonder of the universe, or in that obscure hiding-place in the thicket at Audley Court. At another time he would be seized with a sudden horror at the wrong that had been done to the murdered man, and would fain have travelled even more rapidly than the express between Brussels and Paris could carry him in his eagerness to reach the end of his journey, that he might set right this cruel wrong. He was in London at dusk on the 2nd day after that on which he had left Audley Court, and he drove straight to the Clarendon, to inquire after his uncle. He had no intention of seeing Sir Michael, as he had not yet determined how much or how little he should tell him. But he was very anxious to ascertain how the old man had sustained the cruel shock he had so lately endured. I will see Alicia, he thought, she will tell me all about her father. It is only 2 days since he left Audley. I can scarcely expect to hear of any favourable change. But Mr. Audley was not destined to see his cousin that evening, for the servants at the Clarendon told him that Sir Michael and his daughter had left by the morning mail for Paris, on their way to Vienna. Robert was very well pleased to receive this intelligence. It afforded him a welcome respite, for it would be decidedly better to tell the baronet nothing of his guilty wife until he returned to England, with health unimpaired and spirits re-established. It was to be hoped. Mr. Audley drove to the Temple. The chambers which had seemed dreary to him ever since the disappearance of George Talboys, were doubly so tonight. For that which had been only a dark suspicion had now become a horrible certainty. There was no longer room for the palest ray, the most transitory glimmer of hope. His worst terrors had been too well founded. George Talboys had been cruelly and treacherously murdered by the wife he had loved and mourned. There were 3 letters waiting for Mr. Audley at his chambers. One was from Sir Michael, and another from Alicia. The third was addressed in a hand the young barrister knew only too well, though he had seen it but once before. His face flushed redly at the sight of the superscription, and he took the letter in his hand, carefully and tenderly, as if it had been a living thing, and sentient to his touch. He turned it over and over in his hands, looking at the crest upon the envelope, at the postmark, at the colour of the paper, and then put it into the bosom of his waistcoat with a strange smile upon his face. What a wretched and unconscionable fool I am, he thought. Have I laughed at the follies of weak men all my life, and am I to be more foolish than the weakest of them at last? The beautiful brown-eyed creature. Why did I ever see her? Why did my relentless nemesis ever point the way to that dreary house in Dorsetshire? He opened the first 2 letters. He was foolish enough to keep the last for a delicious morsel, a fairy-like dessert after the commonplace substantialities of a dinner. Alicia's letter told him that Sir Michael had borne his agony with such a persevering tranquillity that she had become at last far more alarmed by his patient calmness than by any stormy manifestation of despair. In this difficulty she had secretly called upon the physician who attended the Audley household in any cases of serious illness, and had requested this gentleman to pay Sir Michael an apparently accidental visit. He had done so, and after stopping half an hour with the baronet, had told Alicia that there was no present danger of any serious consequence from this great grief, but that it was necessary that every effort should be made to arouse Sir Michael, and to force him, however unwillingly, into action. Alicia had immediately acted upon this advice, had resumed her old empire as a spoiled child, and reminded her father of a promise he had made of taking her through Germany. With considerable difficulty she had induced him to consent to fulfilling this old promise, and having once gained her point, she had contrived that they should leave England as soon as it was possible to do so, and she told Robert, in conclusion, that she would not bring her father back to his old house until she had taught him to forget the sorrows associated with it. The baronet's letter was very brief. It contained 6 blank cheques on Sir Michael Audley's London bankers. "You will require money, my dear Robert," he wrote, "for such arrangements as you may think fit to make for the future comfort of the person I committed to your care. I need scarcely tell you that those arrangements cannot be too liberal. But perhaps it is as well that I should tell you now, for the first and only time, that it is my earnest wish never again to hear that person's name. I have no wish to be told the nature of the arrangements you may make for her. I am sure that you will act conscientiously and mercifully. I seek to know no more. Whenever you want money, you will draw upon me for any sums that you may require, but you will have no occasion to tell me for whose use you want that money." Robert Audley breathed a long sigh of relief as he folded this letter. It released him from a duty which it would have been most painful for him to perform, and it forever decided his course of action with regard to the murdered man. George Talboys must lie at peace in his unknown grave, and Sir Michael Audley must never learn that the woman he had loved bore the red brand of murder on her soul. Robert had only the 3rd letter to open, the letter which he had placed in his bosom while he read the others. He tore open the envelope, handling it carefully and tenderly as he had done before. The letter was as brief as Sir Michael's. It contained only these few lines. "Dear Mr. Audley, the rector of this place has been twice to see Marks, the man you saved in the fire at the Castle Inn. He lies in a very precarious state at his mother's cottage, near Audley Court, and is not expected to live many days. His wife is attending him, and both he and she have expressed a most earnest desire that you should see him before he dies. Pray come without delay. Yours very sincerely, Clara Talboys. Mount Stanning Rectory, March 6. Robert Audley folded this letter very reverently, and placed it underneath that part of his waistcoat which might be supposed to cover the region of his heart. Having done this, he seated himself in his favorite armchair, filled and lighted a pipe and smoked it out, staring reflectingly at the fire as long as his tobacco lasted. "What can that man Marks want with me?" thought the barrister. "He is afraid to die until he has made confession, perhaps. He wishes to tell me that which I know already, the story of my lady's crime. I knew that he was in the secret. I was sure of it even upon the night on which I first saw him. He knew the secret, and he traded on it." Robert Audley shrank strangely from returning to Essex. How should he meet Clara Talboys now that he knew the secret of her brother's fate? How many lies he should have to tell, or how much equivocation he must use in order to keep the truth from her? Yet would there be any mercy in telling that horrible story, the knowledge of which must cast a blight upon her youth, and blot out every hope she had even secretly cherished? He knew by his own experience how possible it was to hope against hope, and to hope unconsciously. And he could not bear that her heart should be crushed as his had been by the knowledge of the truth. Better that she should hope vainly to the last, he thought. Better that she should go through life seeking the clue to her lost brother's fate, than that I should give that clue into her hands, and say, our worst fears are realized. The brother you loved has been foully murdered in the early promise of his youth. But Clara Talboys had written to him, imploring him to return to Essex without delay. Could he refuse to do her bidding, however painful its accomplishment might be? And again, the man was dying, perhaps, and had implored to see him. Would it not be cruel to refuse to go, to delay an hour unnecessarily? He looked at his watch. It wanted only 5 minutes to 9. There was no train to Audley after the Ipswich mail, which left London at 8:30, but there was a train that left Shoreditch at 11, and stopped at Brentwood between 12 and 1. Robert decided upon going by this train, and walking the distance between Brentwood and Audley, which was upwards of 6 miles. Fleet Street was quiet and lonely at this late hour, and Robert Audley, being in a ghost-seeing mood, would have been scarcely astonished had he seen Johnson set come roistering westward in the lamplight, or blind John Milton groping his way down the steps before St. Bride's Church. Mr. Audley hailed a hansom at the corner of Farrington Street, and was rattled rapidly away across tenantless Smithfield Market, and into a labyrinth of dingy streets that brought him out upon the broad grandeur of Finsbury Pavement. The hansom rattled up the steep and stony approach to Shoreditch Station, and deposited Robert at the doors of that unlovely temple. There were very few people going to travel by this midnight train, and Robert walked up and down the long wooden platform, reading the huge advertisements whose gaunt lettering looked wan and ghastly in the dim lamplight. He had the carriage in which he sat all to himself. All to himself, did I say? Had he not lately summoned to his side that ghostly company which of all companionship is the most tenacious? The shadow of George Talboys pursued him, even in the comfortable first-class carriage, and was behind him when he looked out of the window, and was yet far ahead of him and the rushing engine. In that thicket toward which the train was speeding, by the side of the unhallowed hiding-place in which the mortal remains of the dead man lay, neglected and uncared for. I must give my lost friend decent burial, Robert thought, as the chill wind swept across the flat landscape, and struck him with such frozen breath as might have emanated from the lips of the dead. I must do it, or I shall die of some panic like this which has seized upon me tonight. I must do it, at any peril, at any cost. Even at the price of that revelation which will bring the mad woman back from her safe hiding-place, and place her in a criminal dock. He was glad when the train stopped at Brentwood at a few minutes after 12. It was 1:30 when the night wanderer entered the village of Audley. And it was only there that he remembered that Clara Talboys had omitted to give him any direction by which he might find the cottage in which Luke Marks lay. It was Dawson who recommended that the poor creature should be taken to his mother's cottage, Robert thought, by and by, and, I dare say, Dawson has attended him ever since the fire. He'll be able to tell me the way to the cottage. Acting upon this idea, Mr. Audley stopped at the house in which Helen Talboys had lived before her second marriage. The door of the little surgery was ajar, and there was a light burning within. Robert pushed the door open and peeped in. The surgeon was standing at the mahogany counter, mixing a draught in a glass measure, with his hat close beside him. Late as it was, he had evidently only just come in. The harmonious snoring of his assistant sounded from a little room within the surgery. I am sorry to disturb you, Mr. Dawson, Robert said, apologetically, as the surgeon looked up and recognized him, but I have come down to see Marks, who, I hear, is in a very bad way. And I want you to tell me the way to his mother's cottage. I'll show you the way, Mr. Audley, answered the surgeon, I am going there this minute. The man is very bad, then? So bad that he can be no worse. The change that can happen is that change which will take him beyond the reach of any earthly suffering. Strange, exclaimed Robert. He did not appear to be much burned. He was not much burnt. Had he been, I should never have recommended his being removed from Mount Stanning. It is the shock that has done the business. He has been in a raging fever for the last 2 days. But tonight he is much calmer, and I'm afraid, before tomorrow night, we shall have seen the last of him. He has asked to see me, I am told, said Mr. Audley. Yes, answered the surgeon, carelessly. A sick man's fancy, no doubt. You dragged him out of the house, and did your best to save his life. I dare say, rough and boorish as the poor fellow is, he thinks a good deal of that. They had left the surgery, the door of which Mr. Dawson had locked behind him. There was money in the till, perhaps, for surely the village apothecary could not have feared that the most daring housebreaker would imperil his liberty in the pursuit of blue pill and colocynth, of salts and senna. The surgeon led the way along the silent street, and presently turned into a lane at the end of which Robert Audley saw the wan glimmer of a light. A light which told of the watch that is kept by the sick and dying, a pale, melancholy light, which always has a dismal aspect when looked upon in this silent hour betwixt night and morning. It shone from the window of the cottage in which Luke Marks lay, watched by his wife and mother. Mr. Dawson lifted the latch, and walked into the common room of the little tenement, followed by Robert Audley. It was empty, but a feeble tallow candle, with a broken back, and a long, cauliflower-headed wick, sputtered upon the table. The sick man lay in the room above. "Shall I tell him you are here?" asked Mr. Dawson. Yes, if you please. But be cautious how you tell him, if you think the news likely to agitate him. I am in no hurry. I can wait. You can call me when you think I can safely come upstairs. The surgeon nodded, and softly ascended the narrow wooden stairs leading to the upper chamber. Robert Audley seated himself in a Windsor chair by the cold hearthstone, and stared disconsolately about him. But he was relieved at last by the low voice of the surgeon, who looked down from the top of the little staircase to tell him that Luke Marks was awake, and would be glad to see him. Robert immediately obeyed this summons. He crept softly up the stairs, and took off his hat before he bent his head to enter at the low doorway of the humble rustic chamber. He took off his hat in the presence of this common peasant man, because he knew that there was another and a more awful presence hovering about the room, and eager to be admitted. Phoebe Marks was sitting at the foot of the bed, with her eyes fixed upon her husband's face, not with any very tender expression in the pale light, but with a sharp, terrified anxiety, which showed that it was the coming of death itself that she dreaded, rather than the loss of her husband. The old woman was busy at the fireplace, airing linen, and preparing some mess of broth which it was not likely the patient would ever eat. The sick man lay with his head propped up by pillows, his coarse face deadly pale, and his great hands wandering uneasily about the coverlet. Phoebe had been reading to him, for an open testament lay among the medicine and lotion bottles upon the table near the bed. Every object in the room was neat and orderly, and bore witness of that delicate precision which had always been a distinguishing characteristic of Phoebe. The young woman rose as Robert Audley crossed the threshold, and hurried toward him. "Let me speak to you for a moment, sir, before you talk to Luke," she said, in an eager whisper. "Pray let me speak to you first." "What's the gal sayin' there?" asked the invalid in a subdued roar, which died away hoarsely on his lips. He was feebly savage, even in his weakness. The dull glaze of death was gathering over his eyes, but they still watched Phoebe with a sharp glance of dissatisfaction. "What's she up to there?" he said. "I won't have no plot tin and no hat-chin agen me. I want to speak to Mr. Audley my own self, and whatever I done I'm goin' to answer for. If I done any mischief, I'm goin' to try and undo it." "What's she sayin'?" "She ain't sayin' nothin', lovey," answered the old woman, going to the bedside of her son, who even when made more interesting than usual by illness, did not seem a very fit subject for this tender appellation. "She's only tellin' the gentleman how bad you've been, my pretty." "What I'm goin' to tell I'm only goin' to tell to him, remember," growled Mr. Mark. And catch me a tellin' of it to him if it warn't for what he done for me the other night. To be sure not, lovey, answered the old woman soothingly. Phoebe Marks had drawn Mr. Audley out of the room and onto the narrow landing at the top of the little staircase. This landing was a platform of about 3 feet square, and it was as much as the two could manage to stand upon it without pushing each other against the whitewashed wall. Or backward down the stairs. "Oh, sir, I wanted to speak to you so badly," Phoebe answered, eagerly. "You know what I told you when I found you safe and well upon the night of the fire?" "Yes, yes. I told you what I suspected, what I think still." "Yes, I remember. But I never breathed a word of it to anybody but you, sir, and I think that Luke has forgotten all about that night. I think that what went before the fire has gone clean out of his head altogether. He was tipsy, you know, when she came to the castle. And I think he was so dazed and scared like by the fire that it all went out of his memory. He doesn't suspect what I suspect, at any rate, or he'd have spoken of it to anybody or everybody. But he's dreadful spiteful against my lady, for he says if she'd have let him have a place at Brentwood or Chelmsford, this wouldn't have happened. So what I wanted to beg of you, sir, is not to let a word drop before Luke." "Yes, yes, I understand, I will be careful. My lady has left the court, I hear, sir?" "Yes." "Never to come back, sir?" "Never to come back." "But she has not gone where she'll be cruelly treated, where she'll be ill-used?" "No, she will be very kindly treated." "I'm glad of that, sir. I beg your pardon for troubling you with the question, sir, but my lady was a kind mistress to me." Luke's voice, husky and feeble, was heard within the little chamber at this period of the conversation, demanding angrily when that gal would have done jawing. Upon which Phoebe put her finger to her lips, and led Mr. Audley back into the sick-room. "I don't want you," said Mr. Marks, decisively, as his wife re-entered the chamber, "I don't want you. You've no call to hear what I've got to say, I only want Mr. Audley, and I wants to speak to him all alone, with none o' your sneakin' listenin' at doors, d'ye hear? So you may go downstairs and keep there till you're wanted, and you may take mother, no, mother may stay, I shall want her presently." The sick man's feeble hand pointed to the door, through which his wife departed very submissively. "I've no wish to hear anything, Luke," she said, "but I hope you won't say anything against those that have been good and generous to you." "I shall say what I like," answered Mr. Marks, fiercely, "and I'm not a-goin' to be ordered by you. You ain't the parson, as I've ever heard of, nor the lawyer neither." The landlord of the castle inn had undergone no moral transformation by his deathbed sufferings, fierce and rapid as they had been. Perhaps some faint glimmer of a light that had been far off from his life now struggled feebly through the black obscurities of ignorance that darkened his soul. Perhaps a half-angry, half-sullen penitence urged him to make some rugged effort to atone for a life that had been selfish and drunken and wicked. Be it how it might, he wiped his white lips, and turning his haggard eyes earnestly upon Robert Audley, pointed to a chair by the bedside. "You made game of me in a general way, Mr. Audley," he said, presently, "and you've drawed me out, and you've tumbled and tossed me about like in a gentlemanly way, till I was nothink or anythink in your hands. And you've looked me through and through, and turned me inside out till you thought you knowed as much as I knowed. I'd no particular call to be grateful to you, not before the fire at the castle t'other night. But I am grateful to you for that. I'm not grateful to folks in a general way, praps, because the things as gentlefolks have a most always been the very things I didn't want. They've give me soup, and tracts, and flannel, and coals, but, Lord, they've made such a precious noise about it that I'd have been to send 'em all back to 'em. But when a gentleman goes and puts his own life in danger to save a drunken brute like me, the drunkenest brute as ever was feels grateful like to that gentleman. And wishes to say before he dies, which he sees in the doctor's face as he ain't got long to live, 'Thank ye, sir, I'm obliged to you.'" Luke Marks stretched out his left hand, the right hand had been injured by the fire, and was wrapped in linen, and groped feebly for that of Mr. Robert Audley. The young man took the coarse but shrunken hand in both his own, and pressed it cordially. "I need no thanks, Luke Marks," he said. "I was very glad to be of service to you." Mr. Marks did not speak immediately. He was lying quietly upon his side, staring reflectingly at Robert Audley. "You was uncommon fond of that gent as disappeared at the court, warn't you, sir?" he said at last. Robert started at the mention of his dead friend. "You was uncommon fond of that Mr. Talboys, I've heard say, sir," repeated Luke. "Yes, yes," answered Robert, rather impatiently, "he was my very dear friend. I've heard the servants at the court say how you took on when you couldn't find him. I've heard the landlord of the Sun Inn say how cut up you was when you first missed him. If the two gents had been brothers, the landlord said, our gent, you, sir, couldn't have been more cut up when he missed the other." "Yes, yes, I know," said Robert. "Pray do not speak any more of this subject. I cannot tell you how much it distresses me. Was he to be haunted forever by the ghost of his unburied friend? He came here to comfort the sick man, and even here he was pursued by this relentless shadow, even here he was reminded of the secret crime which had darkened his life. Listen to me, Marks," he said, earnestly, "believe me that I appreciate your grateful words, and that I am very glad to have been of service to you. But before you say anything more, let me make one most solemn request. If you have sent for me that you may tell me anything of the fate of my lost friend, I entreat you to spare yourself and to spare me that horrible story. You can tell me nothing which I do not already know. The worst you can tell me of the woman who was once in your power, has already been revealed to me by her own lips. Pray, then, be silent upon this subject. I say again, you can tell me nothing which I do not know." Luke Marks looked musingly at the earnest face of his visitor, and some shadowy expression, which was almost like a smile, flitted feebly across the sick man's haggard features. "I can't tell you nothin' you don't know?" he asked. "Nothing. Then it ain't no good for me to try," said the invalid, thoughtfully. "Did she tell you?" he asked, after a pause. "I must beg, Marks, that you will drop the subject," Robert answered, almost sternly. "I have already told you that I do not wish to hear it spoken of. Whatever discoveries you made your market out of them. Whatever guilty secrets you got possession of, you were paid for keeping silence. You had better keep silence to the end." "Had I?" cried Luke Marks, in an eager whisper. "Had I really now better hold my tongue to the last?" "I think so, most decidedly. You traded on your secret, and you were paid to keep it. It would be more honest to hold to your bargain, and keep it still." "Would it now?" said Mr. Marks with a ghastly grin. "But suppose my lady had one secret and I another. How then?" "What do you mean?" "Suppose I could have told something all along, and would have told it, perhaps, if I'd been a little better treated. If what was give to me had been give a little more liberal-like, and not flung at me as if I was a dog, and was only give it to be kept from bit in. Suppose I could have told something, and would have told it but for that? How then?" It was impossible to describe the ghastliness of the triumphant grin that lighted up the sick man's haggard face. His mind is wandering, Robert thought. I had need be patient with him, poor fellow. It would be strange if I could not be patient with a dying man. Luke Marks lay staring at Mr. Audley for some moments with that triumphant grin upon his face. The old woman, wearied out with watching her dying son, had dropped into a doze, and sat nodding her sharp chin over the handful of fire, upon which the broth that was never to be eaten still bubbled and simmered. Mr. Audley waited very patiently until it should be the sick man's pleasure to speak. Every sound was painfully distinct in that dead hour of the night. The dropping of the ashes on the hearth, the ominous crackling of the burning coals, the slow and ponderous ticking of the sulky clock in the room below. The low moaning of the March wind, which might have been the voice of an English banshee, screaming her dismal warning to the watchers of the dying. The hoarse breathing of the sick man, every sound held itself apart from all other sounds, and made itself into a separate voice, loud with a gloomy portent in the solemn stillness of the house. Robert sat with his face shaded by his hands, thinking what was to become of him now that the secret of his friend's fate had been told. And the dark story of George Talboys and his wicked wife had been finished in the Belgian madhouse. What was to become of him? He had no claim upon Clara Talboys, for he had resolved to keep the horrible secret that had been told to him. How then could he dare to meet her with that secret held back from her? How could he ever look into her earnest eyes, and yet withhold the truth? He felt that all power of reservation would fail before the searching glance of those calm brown eyes. If he was indeed to keep this secret, he must never see her again. To reveal it would be to embitter her life. Could he, for any selfish motive of his own, tell her this terrible story? Or could he think that if he told her she would suffer her murdered brother to lie unavenged and forgotten in his unhallowed grave? Hemmed in on every side by difficulties which seemed utterly insurmountable. With the easy temperament which was natural to him embittered by the gloomy burden he had borne so long, Robert Audley looked hopelessly forward to the life which lay before him, and thought that it would have been better for him had he perished among the burning ruins of the Castle Inn. Who would have been sorry for me? No one but my poor little Alicia, he thought, and hers would have only been an April sorrow. Would Clara Talboys have been sorry? No. She would have only regretted me as a lost link in the mystery of her brother's death. She would only. Chapter 39. That which the dying man had to tell. Heaven knows whither Mr. Audley's thoughts might have wandered had he not been startled by a sudden movement of the sick man, who raised himself up in his bed and called to his mother. The old woman woke up with a jerk, and turned sleepily enough to look at her son. "What is it, Luke, dearie?" she asked soothingly. "It ain't time for the doctor's stuff yet. Mr. Dawson said as you weren't to have it till 2 hours after he went away, and he ain't been gone an hour yet." "Who said it was the doctor's stuff I wanted?" cried Mr. Marks, impatiently. "I want to ask you something, mother. Do you remember the 7th of last September?" Robert started, and looked eagerly at the sick man. Why did he harp upon this forbidden subject? Why did he insist upon recalling the date of George's murder? The old woman shook her head in feeble confusion of mind. "Lord, Luke," she said, "how can ye ask me such questions? My memory's been a failin' me this 8 or 9 year, and I never was one to remember the days of the month, or aught o' that sort. How should a poor workin' woman remember such things?" Luke Marks shrugged his shoulders impatiently. "You're a good un to do what's asked you, mother," he said, peevishly. "Didn't I tell you to remember that day? Didn't I tell you as the time might come when you'd be called upon to bear witness about it, and put upon your Bible oath about it? Didn't I tell you that, mother?" The old woman shook her head hopelessly. "If you say so, I make no doubt you did, Luke," she said, with a conciliatory smile, "but I can't call it to mind, lovey. My memory's been failin' me this 9 year, sir," she added, turning to Robert Audley, "and I'm but a poor critter." Mr. Audley laid his hand upon the sick man's arm. "Marks," he said, "I tell you again, you have no cause to worry yourself about this matter. I ask you no questions, I have no wish to hear anything." "But, suppose I want to tell something," cried Luke, with feverish energy, "suppose I feel I can't die with a secret on my mind, and have asked to see you on purpose that I might tell you. Suppose that, and you'll suppose nothing but the truth. I'd have been burnt alive before I'd have told her." He spoke these words between his set teeth, and scowled savagely as he uttered them. "I'd have been burnt alive first. I made her pay for her pretty insolent ways, I made her pay for her airs and graces, I'd never have told her, never, never. I had my power over her, and I kept it. I had my secret and was paid for it, and there wasn't a petty slight as she ever put upon me or mine that I didn't pay her out for 20 times over." "Marks, Marks, for heaven's sake be calm," said Robert, earnestly. "What are you talking of? What is it that you could have told?" "I may go in to tell you," answered Luke, wiping his lips. Give us a drink, mother." The old woman poured out some cooling drink into a mug, and carried it to her son. He drank it in an eager hurry, as if he felt that the brief remainder of his life must be a race with the pitiless pedestrian, time. "Stop where you are," he said to his mother, pointing to a chair at the foot of the bed. The old woman obeyed, and seated herself meekly opposite to Mr. Audley. "I'll ask you another question, mother," said Luke, "and I think it'll be strange if you can't answer it. Do you remember when I was at work upon Atkinson's farm? Before I was married, you know, and when I was livin' down here along of you?" "Yes, yes," Mrs. Marks answered, nodding triumphantly, "I remember that, my dear. It were last fall, just about as the apples was bein' gathered in the orchard across our lane, and about the time as you had your new sprigged waistcoat." "I remember, Luke, I remember." Mr. Audley wondered where all this was to lead to, and how long he would have to sit by the sick man's bed, hearing a conversation that had no meaning to him. "If you remember that much, maybe you'll remember more, mother," said Luke. "Can you call to mind my bringing someone home here one night, while Atkinson's was stackin' the last o' their corn?" Once more Mr. Audley started violently, and this time he looked up earnestly at the face of the speaker, and listened, with a strange, breathless interest, that he scarcely understood himself, to what Luke Marks was saying. "I recollect your bringing home Phoebe," the old woman answered, with great animation. "I recollect your bringin' Phoebe home to take a cup o' tea or a little snack o' supper, a mort o' times." "Bother Phoebe," cried Mr. Marks, "who's a talkin' of Phoebe? What's Phoebe, that anybody should go to put theirselves out about her? Do you remember my bringin' home a gentleman after 10 o'clock, one September night? A gentleman as was wet through to the skin, and was covered with mud and slush, and green slime and black muck, from the crown of his head to the sole of his foot, and had his arm broke. And his shoulder swelled up awful. And was such a object that nobody would ha knowed him. A gentleman as had to have his clothes cut off him in some places, and as sat by the kitchen fire, starin' at the coals as if he had gone mad or stupid like, and didn't know where he was. Or who he was. And as had to be cared for like a baby, and dressed, and dried, and washed, and fed with spoonfuls of brandy, that had to be forced between his locked teeth, before any life could be got into him? Do you remember that, mother?" The old woman nodded, and muttered something to the effect that she remembered all these circumstances most vividly, now that Luke happened to mention them. Robert Audley uttered a wild cry, and fell down upon his knees by the side of the sick man's bed. "My God," he ejaculated, "I thank thee for thy wondrous mercies. George Talboys is alive." "Wait a bit," said Mr. Marks, "don't you be too fast. Mother, give us down that tin box on the shelf over against the chest of drawers, will you?" The old woman obeyed, and after fumbling among broken teacups and milk jugs, lidless wooden cotton boxes, and a miscellaneous litter of rags and crockery, produced a tin snuff-box with a sliding lid. A shabby, dirty-looking box enough. Robert Audley still knelt by the bedside with his face hidden by his clasped hands. Luke Marks opened the tin box. "There ain't no money in it, more's the pity," he said, "or if there had been it wouldn't have been let stop very long. But there's summat in it that perhaps you'll think quite as valuable as money, and that's what I'm goin' to give you as a proof that a drunken brute can feel thankful to them as is kind to him." He took out 2 folded papers, which he gave into Robert Audley's hands. They were 2 leaves torn out of a pocketbook, and they were written upon in pencil, and in a handwriting that was quite strange to Mr. Audley, a cramped, stiff, and yet scrawling hand. Such as some ploughman might have written. "I don't know this writing," Robert said, as he eagerly unfolded the first of the 2 papers. "What has this to do with my friend? Why do you show me these?" "Suppose you read 'em first," said Mr. Marks, "and ask me questions about them afterwards." The first paper which Robert Audley had unfolded contained the following lines, written in that cramped, yet scrawling hand which was so strange to him. "My dear friend, I write to you in such utter confusion of mind as perhaps no man ever before suffered. I cannot tell you what has happened to me, I can only tell you that something has happened which will drive me from England a broken-hearted man, to seek some corner of the earth in which I may live and die unknown and forgotten. I can only ask you to forget me. If your friendship could have done me any good, would have appealed to it. If your counsel could have been any help to me, I would have confided in you. But neither friendship nor counsel can help me, and all I can say to you is this: God bless you for the past, and teach you to forget me in the future. G.T. The second paper was addressed to another person, and its contents were briefer than those of the first. Helen, may God pity and forgive you for that which you have done today, as truly as I do. Rest in peace. You shall never hear of me again. To you and to the world I shall henceforth be that which you wished me to be today. You need fear no molestation from me. I leave England never to return. G.T. Robert Audley sat staring at these lines in hopeless bewilderment. They were not in his friend's familiar hand, and yet they purported to be written by him and were signed with his initials. He looked scrutinizingly at the face of Luke Marks, thinking that perhaps some trick was being played upon him. This was not written by George Talboys, he said. It was, answered Luke Marks, it was written by Mr. Talboys, every line of it. He wrote it with his own hand, but it was his left hand, for he couldn't use his right because of his broken arm. Robert Audley looked up suddenly, and the shadow of suspicion passed away from his face. I understand, he said, I understand. Tell me all, tell me how it was that my poor friend was saved. I was at work up at Atkinson's farm, last September, said Luke Marks, helping to stack the last of the corn. And as the nighest way from the farm to Mother's cottage was through the meadows at the back of the court, I used to come that way. And Phoebe used to stand in the garden wall beyond the lime walk sometimes, to have a chat with me, knowin' my time comin' home. I don't know what Phoebe was doin' upon the evenin' of the 7th September, I recollect the date because Farmer Atkinson paid me my wages all of a lump on that day. And I'd had to sign a bit of a receipt for the money he give me. I don't know what she was doin', but she warn't at the gate in the lime walk. So I went round to the other side the gardens and jumped across the dry ditch, for I wanted particular to see her that night. As I was goin' away to work upon a farm beyond Chelmsford the next day. Audley church clock struck 9 as I was crossin' the meadows between Atkinson's and the court, and it must have been about 9:15 when I got into the kitchen garden. I crossed the garden, and went into the lime walk. The nighest way to the servants' hall took me through the shrubbery and past the dry well. It was a dark night, but I knew my way well enough about the old place, and the light in the window of the servants' hall looked red and comfortable through the darkness. I was close against the mouth of the dry well when I heard a sound that made my blood creep. It was a groan of a man in pain, as was lyin' somewhere hid among the bushes. I warn't afraid of ghosts and I warn't afraid of anythink in a general way, but there was somethin' in hearin' this groan as chilled me to the very heart, and for a minute I was struck all of a heap. And didn't know what to do. But I heard the groan again, and then I began to search among the bushes. I found a man lyin' hidden under a lot laurels, and I thought at first he was up to no good, and I was goin' to collar him to take him to the house. When he caught me by the wrist without gettin' up from the ground, but lookin' at me very earnest, as I could see by the way his face was turned toward me in the darkness, and asked me who I was. And what I was, and what I had to do with the folks at the court. There was somethin' in the way he spoke that told me he was a gentleman, though I didn't know him from Adam, and couldn't see his face, and I answered his questions civil. I want to get away from this place, he said, without bein' seen by any livin' creetur, remember that. I've been lyin' here ever since 4 o'clock today, and I'm half dead, but I want to get away without bein' seen, mind that. I told him that was easy enough, but I began to think my first thoughts of him might have been right enough, after all. And that he couldn't have been up to no good to want to sneak away so precious quiet. Can you take me to any place where I can get a change of dry clothes, he says, without half a dozen people knowin' it? He'd got up into a sittin' attitude by this time, and I could see that his right arm hung close by his side, and that he was in pain. I pointed to his arm, and asked him what was the matter with it, but he only answered, very quiet-like, "Broken, my lad, broken." "Not that that's much," he says in another tone, speaking to himself like, more than to me. "There's broken hearts as well as broken limbs, and they're not so easy mended." I told him I could take him to mother's cottage, and that he could dry his clothes there and welcome. "Can your mother keep a secret?" he asked. "Well, she could keep one well enough if she could remember it," I told him. "But you might tell her all the secrets of the Freemasons, and Foresters, and Bufflers and Oddfellers as ever was, tonight, and she'd have forgotten all about 'em tomorrow mornin'. He seemed satisfied with this, and he got himself up by holdin' on to me, for it seemed as if his limbs was cramped, the use of 'em was almost gone. I felt as he came agin me, that his clothes was wet and mucky. "You haven't been and fell into the fish pond, have you, sir?" I asked. He made no answer to my question. He didn't seem even to have heard it. I could see now he was standin' upon his feet that he was a tall, fine-made man, a head and shoulders higher than me. "Take me to your mother's cottage," he said, "and get me some dry clothes if you can. I'll pay you well for your trouble." I knew that the key was mostly left in the wooden gate in the garden wall, so I led him that way. He could scarcely walk at first, and it was only by leanin' heavily upon my shoulder that he managed to get along. I got him through the gate, leavin' it unlocked behind me, and trustin' to the chance of that not bein' noticed by the under gardener, who had the care of the key, and was a careless chap enough. I took him across the meadows, and brought him up here, still keepin' away from the village, and in the fields, where there wasn't a creature to see us at that time o' night. And so I got him into the room downstairs, where mother was sittin' over the fire gettin' my bit o' supper ready for me. I put the strange chap in a chair agin the fire, and then for the first time I had a good look at him. I never see anybody in such a state before. He was all over green damp and muck, and his hands was scratched and cut to pieces. I got his clothes off him how I could, for he was like a child in my hands, and sat starin' at the fire as helpless as any baby. Only givin' a long heavy sigh now and then, as if his heart was goin' to bust. At last he dropped into a kind of a doze, a stupid sort of sleep, and began to nod over the fire, so I ran and got a blanket and wrapped him in it. And got him to lie down on the press bedstead in the room under this. I sent mother to bed, and I sat by the fire and watched him, and kept the fire up till it was just upon daybreak, when he woke up all of a sudden with a start, and said he must go. Directly this minute. I begged him not to think of such a thing and told him he warn't fit to move for ever so long. But he said he must go, and he got up, and though he staggered like, and at first could hardly stand steady 2 minutes together, he wouldn't be beat. And he got me to dress him in his clothes as I'd dried and cleaned as well as I could while he laid asleep. I did manage it at last, but the clothes was awful spoiled, and he looked a dreadful object, with his pale face and a great cut on his forehead that I'd washed and tied up with a handkercher. He could only get his coat on by buttoning it on round his neck, for he couldn't put a sleeve upon his broken arm. But he held out agin everything, though he groaned every now and then. And what with the scratches and bruises on his hands, and the cut upon his forehead, and his stiff limbs and broken arm, he'd plenty of call to groan. And by the time it was broad daylight he was dressed and ready to go. "What's the nearest town to this upon the London road?" he asked me. I told him as the nighest town was Brentwood. "Very well, then," he says, "if you'll go with me to Brentwood, and take me to some surgeon as'll set my arm, I'll give you a £5 note for that and all your other trouble." I told him that I was ready and willin' to do anything as he wanted done. And asked him if I shouldn't go and see if I could borrow a cart from some of the neighbors to drive him over in, for I told him it was a good 6 miles walk. He shook his head. "No, no, no," he said, he didn't want anybody to know anything about him, he'd rather walk it. He did walk it, and he walked like a good un, too. Though I know as every step he took them 6 miles he took in pain, but he held out as he'd held out before. I never see such a chap to hold out in all my blessed life. He had to stop sometimes and lean agin a gateway to get his breath. But he held out still, till at last we got into Brentwood, and then he says, "Take me to the nighest surgeon's," and I waited while he had his arms set in splints, which took a precious long time. The surgeon wanted him to stay in Brentwood till he was better, but he said it warn't to be heard on, he must get up to London without a minute's loss of time. So the surgeon made him as comfortable as he could, considering, and tied up his arm in a sling. Robert Audley started. A circumstance connected with his visit to Liverpool dashed suddenly back upon his memory. He remembered the clerk who had called him back to say there was a passenger who took his berth on board the Victoria Regia within an hour or so of the vessel's sailing. A young man with his arm in a sling, who had called himself by some common name, which Robert had forgotten. When his arm was dressed, continued Luke, he says to the surgeon, "Can you give me a pencil to write something before I go away?" The surgeon smiles and shakes his head. "You'll never be able to write with that there hand today," he says, pointing to the arm as had just been dressed. "P'raps not," the young chap answers, quiet enough, "but I can write with the other. Can't I write it for you?" says the surgeon. "No, thank you," answers the other. "What I've got to write is private. If you can give me a couple of envelopes, I'll be obliged to you." With that the surgeon goes to fetch the envelopes, and the young chap takes a pocket-book out of his coat pocket with his left hand. The cover was wet and dirty, but the inside was clean enough, and he tears out a couple of leaves and begins to write upon them as you see. And he writes dreadful awkward with his left hand, and he writes slow, but he contrives to finish what you see, and then he puts the 2 bits o' writin' into the envelopes as the surgeon brings him. And he seals 'em up, and he puts a pencil cross upon one of 'em, and nothing on the other, and then he pays the surgeon for his trouble, and the surgeon says, "Ain't there nothin' more he can do for him, and can't he persuade him to stay in Brentwood till his arm's better?" But he says no, it ain't possible, and then he says to me, "Come along me to the railway station, and I'll give you what I've promised." So I went to the station with him. We was in time to catch the train as stops at Brentwood at 8:30, and we had 5 minutes to spare. So he takes me into a corner of the platform, and he says, "I wants you to deliver these here letters for me," which I told him I was willin'. "Very well, then," he says, "look here. You know Audley Court?" "Yes," I says, "I ought to, for my sweetheart lives lady's maid there." "Who's lady's maid?" he says. So I tells him, "My lady's, the new lady what was governess at Mr. Dawson's." "Very well, then," he says. "This here letter with the cross upon the envelope is for Lady Audley, but you're to be sure to give it into her own hands, and remember to take care as nobody sees you give it." I promises to do this, and he hands me the first letter. And then he says, "Do you know Mr. Audley, as is nevy to Sir Michael?" And I said, "Yes, I've heerd tell on him, and I've heerd as he was a reg'lar swell, but affable and free-spoken, for I heerd tell on you, you know," Luke added, parenthetically. "Now look here," the young chap says, "you're to give this other letter to Mr. Robert Audley, who's stayin' at the Sun Inn, in the village." And I tells him it's all right, as I've knowed the Sun ever since I was a baby. So then he gives me the second letter, what's got nothing wrote upon the envelope, and he gives me a £5 note, accordin' to promise. And then he says, "Good day, and thank you for all your trouble," and he gets into a second-class carriage. And the last I sees of him is a face as white as a sheet of writin' paper, and a great patch of stickin' plaster crisscrossed upon his forehead. Poor George! Poor George! I went back to Audley, and I went straight to the Sun Inn, and asked for you, Mayonine, to deliver both letters faithful, so help me God. Then. But the landlord told me as you'd started off that mornin' for London, and he didn't know when you'd come back, and he didn't know the name o' the place where you lived in London. Though he said he thought it was in one o' them law courts, such as Westminster Hall or Doctors' Commons, or somethin' like that. So what was I to do? I couldn't send a letter by post, not knowin' where to direct to, and I couldn't give it into your own hands, and I'd been told particular not to let anybody else know of it. So I'd nothing to do but to wait and see if you come back, and bide my time for givin' of it to you. I thought I'd go over to the court in the evenin' and see Phoebe, and find out from her when there'd be a chance of seein' her lady, for I knowed she could manage it if she liked. So I didn't go to work that day, though I ought to ha' done, and I lounged and idled about until it was nigh upon dusk, and then I goes down to the meadows behind the court. And there I finds Phoebe sure enough, waitin' agin the wooden door in the wall, on the lookout for me. I hadn't been talkin' to her long before I see there was somethink wrong with her, and I told her as much. Well, she says, I ain't quite myself this evenin', for I had a upset yesterday, and I ain't got over it yet. A upset, I says. You had a quarrel with your missus, I suppose. She didn't answer me directly, but she smiled the queerest smile as ever I see, and presently she says. No, Luke, it weren't nothin', oh, that kind. And what's more, nobody could be friendlier toward me than my lady. I think she'd do anythink for me a'most. And I think, whether it was a bit o' farming stock and furniture or such like, or whether it was the goodwill of a public house, she wouldn't refuse me anythink as I asked her. I couldn't make out this, for it was only a few days before as she'd told me her missus was selfish and extravagant, and we might wait a long time before we could get what we wanted from her. So I says to her, why, this is rather sudden like, Phoebe, and she says, yes, it is sudden, and she smiles again, just the same sort of smile as before. Upon that I turns round upon her sharp, and says, I'll tell you what it is, my gal, you're keepin' something from me, somethink you've been told, or somethink you've found out. And if you think you're goin' to try that game on with me, you'll find you're very much mistaken, and so I give you warning. But she laughed it off like, and says, Lord Luke, what could have put such fancies into your head? Perhaps other people can keep secrets as well as you, I said, and perhaps other people can make friends as well as you. There was a gentleman came here to see your missus yesterday, warn't there, a tall young gentleman with a brown beard? Instead of answering of me like a Christian, my cousin Phoebe bursts out cryin', and wrings her hands, and goes on awful, until I'm dashed if I can make out what she's up to. But little by little I got it out of her, for I wouldn't stand no nonsense. Fine, she told me how she'd been sittin' at work at the window of her little room, which was at the top of the house, right up in one of the gables, and overlooked the lime walk and the shrubbery and the well, when she see my lady walking with a strange gentleman, and they walked together for a long time, until by and by they stop. Cried Robert, I know the rest. Well, Phoebe told me all about what she see, and she told me she'd met her lady almost directly afterward, and somethin' had passed between 'em, not much, but enough to let her missus know that the servant what she looked down upon had found out that as would put her in that servant's power to the last day of her life. And she is in my power, Luke, says Phoebe, and she'll do anythin' in the world for us if we keep her secret. So you see, both my Lady Audley and her maid thought as the gentleman as I'd seen safe off by the London train was lying dead at the bottom of the well. If I was to give the letter they'd find out the contrary of this, and if I was to give the letter, Phoebe and me would lose the chance of gettin' started in life by her missus. So I kep' the letter and kep' my secret, and my lady kep' hern. But I thought if she acted liberal by me, and gave me the money I wanted, free like, I'd tell her everythink, and make her mind easy. But she didn't. Whatever she give me she throwed me as if I'd been a dog. Whenever she spoke to me, she spoke as she might have spoken to a dog, and a dog she couldn't abide the sight of. There was no word in her mouth that was too bad for me, there was no toss as she could give her head that was too proud and scornful for me. And my blood beiled in her, and I kep' my secret, and let her keep hern. I opened the 2 letters, and I read 'em, but I couldn't make much sense out of 'em, and I hid 'em away. And not a creature but me has seen 'em until this night. Luke Marks had finished his story, and lay quietly enough, exhausted by having talked so long. He watched Robert Audley's face, fully expecting some reproof, some grave lecture, for he had a vague consciousness that he had done wrong. But Robert did not lecture him. He had no fancy for an office which he did not think himself fitted to perform. Robert Audley sat until long after daybreak with the sick man, who fell into a heavy slumber a short time after he had finished his story. The old woman had dozed comfortably throughout her son's confession. Phoebe was asleep upon the press bedstead in the room below, so the young barrister was the only watcher. He could not sleep. He could only think of the story he had heard. He could only thank God for his friend's preservation, and pray that he might be able to go to Clara Talboys, and say, "Your brother still lives, and has been found." Phoebe came upstairs at 8 o'clock, ready to take her place at the sick-bed, and Robert Audley went away, to get a bed at the Sun Inn. It was nearly dusk when he awoke out of a long dreamless slumber, and dressed himself before dining in the little sitting-room, in which he and George had sat together a few months before. The landlord waited upon him at dinner, and told him that Luke Marks had died at 5 o'clock that afternoon. He went off rather sudden-like, the man said, but very quiet. Robert Audley wrote a long letter that evening, addressed to Madame Taylor, care of Monsieur Val, Villabrumius. A long letter in which he told the wretched woman who had borne so many names, and was to bear a false one for the rest of her life, the story that the dying man had told him. It may be some comfort to her to hear that her husband did not perish in his youth by her wicked hand, he thought, if her selfish soul can hold any sentiment of pity or sorrow for others. Chapter 40. Restored. Clara Talboys returned to Dorsetshire, to tell her father that his only son had sailed for Australia upon the 9th of September, and that it was most probable he yet lived, and would return to claim the forgiveness of the father he had never very particularly injured, except in the matter of having made that terrible matrimonial mistake which had exercised so fatal an influence upon his youth. Mr. Harcourt Talboys was fairly nonplussed. Junius Brutus had never been placed in such a position as this, and seeing no way of getting out of this dilemma by acting after his favorite model, Mr. Talboys was fain to be natural for once in his life, and to confess that he had suffered much uneasiness and pain of mind about his only son since his conversation with Robert Audley, and that he would be heartily glad to take his poor boy to his arms, whenever he should return to England. But when was he likely to return? And how was he to be communicated with? That was the question. Robert Audley remembered the advertisements which he had caused to be inserted in the Melbourne and Sydney papers. If George had re-entered either city alive, how was it that no notice had ever been taken of that advertisement? Was it likely that his friend would be indifferent to his uneasiness? But then, again, it was just possible that George Talboys had not happened to see this advertisement. And, as he had travelled under a feigned name, neither his fellow passengers or the captain of the vessel would have been able to identify him with the person advertised for. What was to be done? Must they wait patiently till George grew weary of his exile, and returned to his friends who loved him? Or were there any means to be taken by which his return might be hastened? Robert Audley was at fault. Perhaps, in the unspeakable relief of mind which he had experienced upon the discovery of his friend's escape, he was unable to look beyond the one fact of that providential preservation. In this state of mind he went down to Dorsetshire to pay a visit to Mr. Talboys, who had given way to a perfect torrent of generous impulses, and had gone so far as to invite his son's friend to share the prim hospitality of the square, red-brick mansion. Mr. Talboys had only two sentiments upon the subject of George's story. One was a natural relief and happiness in the thought that his son had been saved, the other was an earnest wish that my lady had been his wife, and that he might thus have had the pleasure of making a signal example of her. "It is not for me to blame you, Mr. Audley," he said, "for having smuggled this guilty woman out of the reach of justice, and thus, as I may say, paltered with the laws of your country. I can only remark that, had the lady fallen into my hands, she would have been very differently treated. It was in the middle of April when Robert Audley found himself once more under those black fir trees beneath which his wandering thoughts had so often stayed since his first meeting with Clara Talboys. There were primroses and early violets in the hedges now, and the streams, which, upon his first visit, had been hard and frost-bound as the heart of Harcourt Talboys, had thawed. Like that gentleman, and ran merrily under the blackthorn bushes in the capricious April sunshine. Robert had a prim bedroom, and an uncompromising dressing-room allotted him in the square house, and he woke every morning upon a metallic spring mattress, which always gave him the idea of sleeping upon some musical instrument, to see the sun glaring in upon him through the square white blinds and lighting up the two lacquered urns which adorned the foot of the blue iron bedstead, until they blazed like two tiny brazen lamps of the Roman period. He emulated Mr. Harcourt Talboys in the matter of shower baths and cold water, and emerged prim and blue as that gentleman himself, as the clock in the hall struck 7. To join the master of the house in his ante-breakfast constitutional under the fir trees in the stiff plantation. But there was generally a third person who assisted in the constitutional promenades, and that third person was Clara Talboys, who used to walk by her father's side. More beautiful than the morning, for that was sometimes dull and cloudy, while she was always fresh and bright, in a broad-leaved straw hat and flapping blue ribbons, 1/4 of an inch of which Mr. Audley would have esteemed a prouder decoration than ever adorned a favoured creature's buttonhole. At first they were very ceremonious toward each other, and were only familiar and friendly upon the one subject of George's adventures. But little by little a pleasant intimacy arose between them, and before the first 3 weeks of Robert's visit had elapsed, Miss Talboys made him happy by taking him seriously in hand and lecturing him on the purposeless life he had led so long, and the little use he had made of the talents and opportunities that had been given to him. How pleasant it was to be lectured by the woman he loved! How pleasant it was to humiliate himself and depreciate himself before her! How delightful it was to get such splendid opportunities of hinting that if his life had been sanctified by an object he might indeed have striven to be something better than an idle flaneur upon the smooth pathways that have no particular goal. That, blessed by the ties which would have given a solemn purpose to every hour of his existence, he might indeed have fought the battle earnestly and unflinchingly. He generally wound up with a gloomy insinuation to the effect that it was only likely he would drop quietly over the edge of the Temple Garden some afternoon when the river was bright and placid in the low sunlight, and the little children had gone home to their tea. "Do you think I can read French novels and smoke mild Turkish until I am 10, Miss Talboys?" he asked. "Do you think there will not come a day in which my meerschaums will be foul, and the French novels more than usually stupid, and life altogether such a dismal monotony that I shall want to get rid of it somehow or other?" I am sorry to say that while this hypocritical young barrister was holding forth in this despondent way, he had mentally sold up his bachelor possessions, including all Michel Levy's publications, and 6 solid silver-mounted meerschaums, pensioned off Mrs. Maloney, and laid out £2,000 or £3,000 in the purchase of a few acres of verdant shrubbery and sloping lawn, embosomed amid which there should be a fairy cottage ornée, whose rustic casements should glimmer out of bowers of myrtle and clematis to see themselves reflected in the purple bosom of the lake. Of course, Clara Talboys was far from discovering the drift of these melancholy lamentations. She recommended Mr. Audley to read hard and think seriously of his profession, and begin life in real earnest. It was a hard, dry sort of existence, perhaps, which she recommended. A life of serious work and application, in which he should strive to be useful to his fellow creatures, and win a reputation for himself. "I'd do all that," he thought, "and do it earnestly, if I could be sure of a reward for my labor. If she would accept my reputation when it was won, and support me in the struggle by her beloved companionship. But what if she sends me away to fight the battle, and marry some hulking country squire while my back is turned?" Being naturally of a vacillating and dilatory disposition, there is no saying how long Mr. Audley might have kept his secret, fearful to speak and break the charm of that uncertainty which, though not always hopeful, was very seldom quite despairing, had not he been hurried by the impulse of an unguarded moment into a full confession of the truth. He had stayed 5 weeks at Grange Heath, and felt that he could not, in common decency, stay any longer, so he had packed his portmanteau one pleasant May morning, and had announced his departure. Mr. Talboys was not the sort of man to utter any passionate lamentations at the prospect of losing his guest. But he expressed himself with a cool cordiality which served with him as the strongest demonstration of friendship. "We have got on very well together, Mr. Audley," he said, "and you have been pleased to appear sufficiently happy in the quiet routine of our orderly household. Nay, more, you have conformed to our little domestic regulations in a manner which I cannot refrain from saying I take as an especial compliment to myself." Robert bowed. How thankful he was to the good fortune which had never suffered him to oversleep the signal of the clanging bell, or led him away beyond the ken of clocks at Mr. Talboys' luncheon hour. "I trust as we have got on so remarkably well together," Mr. Talboys resumed, "you will do me the honour of repeating your visit to Dorsetshire whenever you feel inclined. You will find plenty of sport among my farms, and you will meet with every politeness and attention from my tenants, if you like to bring your gun with you." Robert responded most heartily to these friendly overtures. He declared that there was no earthly occupation that was more agreeable to him than partridge shooting, and that he should be only too delighted to avail himself of the privilege so kindly offered to him. He could not help glancing toward Clara as he said this. The perfect lids drooped a little over the brown eyes, and the faintest shadow of a blush illuminated the beautiful face. But this was the young barrister's last day in Elysium. And there must be a dreary interval of days and nights and weeks and months before the 1st of September would give him an excuse for returning to Dorsetshire. A dreary interval which fresh-coloured young squires or fat widowers of 8 and 40 might use to his disadvantage. It was no wonder, therefore, that he contemplated this dismal prospect with moody despair, and was bad company for Miss Talboys that morning. But in the evening after dinner, when the sun was low in the west, and Harcourt Talboys closeted in his library upon some judicial business with his lawyer and a tenant farmer, Mr. Audley grew a little more agreeable. He stood by Clara's side in one of the long windows of the drawing-room, watching the shadows deepening in the sky and the rosy light growing every moment rosier as the sun died out. He could not help enjoying that quiet tête-à-tête, though the shadow of the next morning's express which was to carry him away to London loomed darkly across the pathway of his joy. He could not help being happy in her presence, forgetful of the past, reckless of the future. They talked of the one subject which was always a bond of union between them. They talked of her lost brother George. She spoke of him in a very melancholy tone this evening. How could she be otherwise than sad, remembering that if he lived, and she was not even sure of that, he was a lonely wanderer far away from all who loved him, and carrying the memory of a blighted life wherever he went. "I cannot think how Papa can be so resigned to my poor brother's absence," she said, "for he does love him, Mr. Audley, even you must have seen lately that he does love him. But I cannot think how he can so quietly submit to his absence. If I were a man, I would go to Australia, and find him, and bring him back. If he was still to be found among the living," she added, in a lower voice. She turned her face away from Robert, and looked out at the darkening sky. He laid his hand upon her arm. It trembled in spite of him, and his voice trembled, too, as he spoke to her. "Shall I go to look for your brother?" he said. "You?" She turned her head, and looked at him earnestly through her tears. "You, Mr. Audley? Do you think that I could ask you to make such a sacrifice for me, or for those I love? And do you think, Clara, that I should think any sacrifice too great a one if it were made for you? Do you think there is any voyage I would refuse to take, if I knew that you would welcome me when I came home, and thank me for having served you faithfully? I will go from one end of the continent of Australia to the other to look for your brother, if you please, Clara. And will never return alive unless I bring him with me, and will take my chance of what reward you shall give me for my labor." Her head was bent, and it was some moments before she answered him. "You are very good and generous, Mr. Audley," she said, at last, and I feel this offer too much to be able to thank you for it. But what you speak of could never be. By what right could I accept such a sacrifice? By the right which makes me your bounden slave forever and ever, whether you will or no. By right of the love I bear you, Clara, cried Mr. Audley, dropping on his knees, rather awkwardly, it must be confessed, and covering a soft little hand that he had found half hidden among the folds of a silken dress, with passionate kisses. I love you, Clara, he said, I love you. You may call for your father, and have me turned out of the house this moment, if you like, but I shall go on loving you all the same. And I shall love you forever and ever, whether you will or no. The little hand was drawn away from his, but not with a sudden or angry gesture, and it rested for one moment lightly and tremulously upon his dark hair. Clara, Clara, he murmured, in a low, pleading voice, shall I go to Australia to look for your brother? There was no answer. I don't know how it is, but there is scarcely anything more delicious than silence in such cases. Every moment of hesitation is a tacit avowal, every pause is a tender confession. Shall we both go, dearest? Shall we go as man and wife? Shall we go together, my dear love, and bring our brother back between us? Mr. Harcourt Talboys, coming into the lamplit room a quarter of an hour afterward, found Robert Audley alone, and had to listen to a revelation which very much surprised him. Like all self-sufficient people, he was tolerably blind to everything that happened under his nose, and he had fully believed that his own society, and the Spartan regularity of his household, had been the attractions which had made Dorsetshire delightful to his guest. He was rather disappointed, therefore, but he bore his disappointment pretty well, and expressed a placid and rather stoical satisfaction at the turn which affairs had taken. So Robert Audley went back to London, to surrender his chambers in Fig Tree Court, and to make all due inquiries about such ships as sailed from Liverpool for Sydney in the month of June. He had lingered until after luncheon at Grange Heath, and it was in the dusky twilight that he entered the shady Temple Courts and found his way to his chambers. He found Mrs. Maloney scrubbing the stairs, as was her wont upon a Saturday evening, and he had to make his way upward amidst an atmosphere of soapy steam that made the balusters greasy under his touch. There's lots of letters, Your Honor, the laundress said, as she rose from her knees and flattened herself against the wall to enable Robert to pass her, and there's some parcels. And there's a gentleman which has called ever so many times, and is waitin' tonight, for I told him you'd written to me to say your rooms were to be aired. He opened the door of his sitting room, and walked in. The canaries were singing their farewell to the setting sun, and the faint, yellow light was flickering upon the geranium leaves. The visitor, whoever he was, sat with his back to the window and his head bent upon his breast. But he started up as Robert Audley entered the room, and the young man uttered a great cry of delight and surprise, and opened his arms to his lost friend, George Talboys. We know how much Robert had to tell. He touched lightly and tenderly upon that subject which he knew was cruelly painful to his friends. He said very little of the wretched woman who was wearing out the remnant of her wicked life in the quiet suburb of the forgotten Belgian city. George Talboys spoke very briefly of that sunny 7th of September, upon which he had left his friend sleeping by the trout stream while he went to accuse his false wife of that conspiracy which had well nigh broken his heart. God knows that from the moment in which I sunk into the black pit, knowing the treacherous hand that had sent me to what might have been my death, my chief thought was of the safety of the woman who had betrayed me. I fell upon my feet upon a mass of slush and mire, but my shoulder was bruised, and my arm broken against the side of the well. I was stunned and dazed for a few minutes, but I roused myself by an effort, for I felt that the atmosphere I breathed was deadly. I had my Australian experiences to help me in my peril. I could climb like a cat. The stones of which the well was built were rugged and irregular, and I was able to work my way upward by planting my feet in the interstices of the stones, and resting my back at times against the opposite side of the well, helping myself as well as I could with my hands, though one arm was crippled. It was hard work, Bob, and it seemed strange that a man who had long professed himself weary of his life, should take so much trouble to preserve it. I think I must have been working upward of half an hour before I got to the top. I know the time seemed an eternity of pain and peril. It was impossible for me to leave the place until after dark without being observed, so I hid myself behind a clump of laurel bushes, and lay down on the grass faint and exhausted to wait for nightfall. The man who found me there told you the rest, Robert. Yes, my poor old friend, yes, he told me all. George had never returned to Australia after all. He had gone on board the Victoria Regia, but had afterward changed his berth for one in another vessel belonging to the same owners, and had gone to New York, where he had stayed as long as he could endure the loneliness of an existence which separated him from every friend he had ever known. Jonathan was very kind to me, Bob, he said. I had enough money to enable me to get on pretty well in my own quiet way, and I meant to have started for the California gold fields to get more when that was gone. I might have made plenty of friends had I pleased, but I carried the old bullet in my breast, and what sympathy could I have with men who knew nothing of my grief? I yearned for the strong grasp of your hand, Bob, the friendly touch of the hand which had guided me through the darkest passage of my life. Chapter 41. At Peace. 2 years have passed since the May twilight in which Robert found his old friend, and Mr. Audley's dream of a fairy cottage has been realized between Teddington Locks and Hampton Bridge, where, amid a little forest of foliage, there is a fantastical dwelling-place of rustic woodwork, whose latticed windows look out upon the river. Here, among the lilies and the rushes on the sloping bank, a brave boy of 8 years old plays with a toddling baby, who peers wonderingly from his nurse's arms at that other baby in the purple depth of the quiet water. Mr. Audley is a rising man upon the home circuit by this time, and has distinguished himself in the great breach of promise case of Hobbes versus Nobbs, and has convulsed the court by his deliciously comic rendering of the faithless Nobbs' amatory correspondence. The handsome dark-eyed boy is Master George Talboys, who declines Musa at Eton, and fishes for tadpoles in the clear water under the spreading umbrage beyond the ivied walls of the academy. But he comes very often to the fairy cottage to see his father, who lives there with his sister and his sister's husband. And he is very happy with his Uncle Robert, his Aunt Clara, and the pretty baby who has just begun to toddle on the smooth lawn that slopes down to the water's brink, upon which there is a little Swiss boathouse and landing stage where Robert and George moor their slender wherries. Other people come to the cottage near Teddington. A bright, merry-hearted girl, and a grey-bearded gentleman, who has survived the trouble of his life, and battled with it as a Christian should. It is more than a year since a black-edged letter, written upon foreign paper, came to Robert Audley, to announce the death of a certain Madame Taylor, who had expired peacefully at Villabrumius, dying after a long illness, which Monsieur Val describes as a maladie de longueur. Another visitor comes to the cottage in this bright summer of 1861, a frank, generous-hearted young man, who tosses the baby and plays with Georgie, and is especially great in the management of the boats, which are never idle when Sir Harry Towers is at Teddington. There is a pretty rustic smoking room over the Swiss boathouse, in which the gentlemen sit and smoke in the summer evenings, and whence they are summoned by Clara and Alicia to drink tea, and eat strawberries and cream upon the lawn. Audley Court is shut up, and a grim old housekeeper reigns paramount in the mansion which my lady's ringing laughter once made musical. A curtain hangs before the pre-Raphaelite portrait, and the blue mold which artists dread gathers upon the Wouvermans and Poussins, the Quips and Tintorettus. The house is often shown to inquisitive visitors, though the baronet is not informed of that fact, and people admire my lady's rooms, and ask many questions about the pretty, fair-haired woman who died abroad. Sir Michael has no fancy to return to the familiar dwelling-place in which he once dreamed a brief dream of impossible happiness. He remains in London until Alicia shall be Lady Towers, when he is to remove to a house he has lately bought in Hertfordshire, on the borders of his son-in-law's estate. George Talboys is very happy with his sister and his old friend. He is a young man yet, remember, and it is not quite impossible that he may, by and by, find someone who will console him for the past. That dark story of the past fades little by little every day, and there may come a time in which the shadow my lady's wickedness has cast upon the young man's life will utterly vanish away. The Meerschaum and the French novels have been presented to a young Templar with whom Robert Audley had been friendly in his bachelor days. And Mrs. Maloney has a little pension, paid her quarterly, for her care of the canaries and geraniums. I hope no one will take objection to my story because the end of it leaves the good people all happy and at peace. If my experience of life has not been very long, it has at least been manifold. And I can safely subscribe to that which a mighty king and a great philosopher declared, when he said, that neither the experience of his youth nor of his age had ever shown him, the righteous forsaken, nor his seed begging their bread.